The Rainbow Dialogues. Written by Saul Rip. Narrated by Saul Rip. Foreword. What began as an exploratory essay in 2007 evolved into The Rainbow Dialogues with the latest ideas added in 2023. One of the primary motives for presenting the ideas associated with the facts and the stories in this essay is to provide an alternative method for individuals within the sexual spectrum to use as a tool for making sense of the world and navigating their lives. From experience observing friends and family who are within the same gender attraction area of the sexual spectrum, I have seen that the current open-ended question mark approach to sexuality has unintended consequences that are not serving individuals or society as a whole. Though unspoken, claiming one's sexuality is a strong affirmation of one's personal identity, which provides incredible levels of stability. Behaving like an anchor to identity, it provides an invisible bastion reinforcing the life decisions of individuals. With the adopted philosophy that sexuality is fluid and always changing, the stability of identity is compromised, making individuals far more vulnerable to the difficulty of everyday life. The alternative philosophy found at the end of this essay presents a divinity-based model that acknowledges the importance of spirituality's influence on individuals and society. This model does not oppose science, but rather provides a supplemental view that can be added to a science-based view as a supplemental lifeline that science itself cannot provide. Introduction. The visible spectrum of light makes up a small fraction of measurable light and color, but it represents a broad example of diversity. The range is vast, and when dealing in terms of pigments, not just light, the variety of color in shade, value, and intensity reaches nearly to infinity. There is not a more appropriate symbol for sexuality than the visible spectrum of color. It seems appropriate, then, that the symbol for homosexuality is a rainbow, but I disagree. The full spectrum of color should be a symbol for all sexuality, not just homosexuality. In the realm of autism, there is a spectrum with many metrics, with individuals situated at every grade of function from extreme to mild. In the realm of sexuality, there is just as much diversity upon the spectrum as there is with autism, if not even more so. Autism is an extreme example of scientific proof that human beings cognitively process external stimuli differently, meaning they experience life differently. With sexuality, it is no different, and while there may be groups that process life in a similar way, the spectrum is so broad that it becomes impossible to prescribe a solution that will work for every single person across the spectrum. In times of crisis, there is an attempt to find a solution that will serve the most people in the least amount of time, and methods are developed to serve the majority, but inevitably, as a matter of limited time and resources, there are stragglers that are left behind. In the crisis of sexuality, historically, homosexuals have been left behind on purpose and treated very much as an anomaly in the system. With the rise and fall of many advanced civilizations that leave behind traces of their sexuality but little more, we are left to wonder if this is territory that we as humanity have covered before. As worldwide population increases, a minority or percentage of human beings with a disposition towards homosexuality has reached a number that it can no longer be ignored and sacrificed for the greater good of the majority. Human rights, ethics, and morality have risen to the point that the majority will no longer stand for the mistreatment of the minority. We have reached a point in our society that we are finally ready for the rainbow dialogues to begin. This is not just a question or conversation regarding homosexuality, but a study of sexuality as a whole, for it has truly proven impossible to examine homosexuality without a deep inspection of sexuality in general. As we delve into this conversation, we recognize that this force of sexuality is something that is acting on all of us, and that we have far more in common than we don't. There is a dissolution of them versus us, creating potential for the conversation to move to a space of we instead. We all have to deal with sexuality. Indeed, how well we deal with it may be the greatest indicator of success in our lives, as well as the greatest indicator of success for our society. Section 1. Conscience, not what's popular. Gentle persuasion often guides the disposition of people in regards to all aspects of thought and behavior. All men and women are susceptible to being swept into the current of conviction based on momentum of a majority alone. Societal peer pressure possesses the strength equal to a blow from the hand of Zeus, and instead of investing the time necessary to individually decipher and weigh the contents of one's heart teemed with life experience, they will invariably bend with the force and allow the wind to toss them to and fro, rather than to take a stance to temper the blow, come what may. I identified myself as one who had neither sufficient life experience to draw upon, or time invested in the study of homosexuality to form an opinion of my own, whereby I could by my own choose how I felt about it independent of any other whispering influence. Conscience, however, may fall on a spectrum as wide and broad as that of sexuality, but then again, perhaps not. How tragic it is that mainstream groups belittle those who declare independence with the presentation of an opposing viewpoint. Causing others to feel inferior for what they have chosen to believe is not the solution to create an improved society. I think it more likely that a diversity of viewpoints acting as checks and balances on each other, behaving much as our established government, will be the solution for a better society. After all of this time spent as a student of this topic, I feel hesitant to give in to the temptation to impose my own opinions upon others and enroll myself in the art of gentle persuasion with the intent of convincing others to see things as I do. My opinions have become my own, and they are strong. The accomplishment that I wish to establish is to adequately present ideas in relation to homosexuality so that individuals can process them one by one, to temporarily hold at bay outside influences, and without the weight of how they will be viewed by those who know them, or how they will be treated by society, perform a self-evaluation, a gut check of conscience, to establish how one feels in response to these ideas I have presented, and from that evaluation, powerfully and unapologetically assert a position in regards to not just homosexuality, but sexuality as a whole. Consider the words of Henry David Thoreau in his essay on civil disobedience. After all, the practical reason why, when the power is once in the hands of the people, a majority are permitted and for a long period continue to rule, is not because they are most likely to be in the right, not because this seems fairest to the minority, but because they are physically the strongest. But a government in which the majority rule in all cases cannot be based on justice, even as far as men understand it. Can there not be a government in which minorities do not virtually decide right and wrong, but conscience, in which majorities decide only those questions to which the rule of expediency is applicable? Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterwards. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right. For the next several pages, I wish for that to be our compass and the lens through which these ideas are considered. Section 2. Moses. It is claimed that Moses authored the first 5 books of the Bible. Moses was raised in the house of Pharaoh at a time when Egypt was arguably the standing world power, and his brother Ramses II grew to become the greatest pharaoh in the history of Egypt, who expanded the architectural marvels of the culture and nation more than any other pharaoh before or after. Moses grew at the feet and alongside the greatest minds of the time. With an elite education, arguably the most elite possible for that era, and a monopoly for writing the history of the world, the story of Adam and Eve is a simple one. But what an efficient one it is for explaining the differences between the sexes. Men greatly define themselves by their work, while women greatly define themselves by the quality of their relationships. What better assignment, then, for the men to eat by the sweat of their brow, and for women to bear children? Both men and women's respective punishments for having eaten the forbidden fruit are the very things they find the most fulfillment in. Not much has changed in the last several thousand years. While past dictators have strived to have control of history and have sought to rewrite history in order to control ideas, I imagine such dictators would have given anything to be in Moses' position. While a world history written by any one person deserves, even begs, scrutiny, I can think of no better story to simply explain the innate natures of men and women than that of Adam and Eve. In addition to that, it is a harmless story that, in my subjective opinion, does not alienate either sex from each other. As far as dictators go, Moses could have done much worse in his record telling the history of the origins of all humankind. Section 3. Chronicling my thoughts from 2007 to 2017. Having established the expectations, I will now embark on enumerating the thoughts and research I have collected over the past 10 years. There are 2 distinct sexes, and there is a spectrum of sexuality that falls on both. Many factors are unique to either sex, while others overlap at times. Some men sympathize with traits and methods of thought dominant in women, and vice versa. Section 4. Written in 2007. I want to begin to dissect the spectrum, to place it under a microscope, and identify some specific diversity in the range of sexuality. To do this, I assert that initially, there are 2 types of homosexuals: those who by their very nature are born with a disposition towards same-sex attractions, and individuals who have no previous disposition to same-sex relationships, but for whatever commit to homosexuality by choice. Most people have fears or insecurities impressed on them by people in their lives, family or strangers that provide an influence to impress an opinion or mode of thinking. As these fears develop, many find the answers they seek, and they make sense of the world around them the best they can, so they can program themselves to fit into the world, into paradigms and molds for behavior and thinking that are previously established, social norms and trends that have been developing and changing for centuries. These social expectations and levels of tolerance for lifestyle and behavior will continue to evolve. The interesting thing is that with awareness of the issue on a massive scale, the evolution can be accelerated. I think, even starting very early in age, that children make meanings of their own uniqueness, behavior, and personality when compared to their peers individually and as a whole. They take note of their differences and do their best to make sense of the world and themselves by analyzing all of the present definitions for labels or types of people: Gothic, non-Gothic, girl, not a girl, homosexual, heterosexual. Which one do I fit under? Which one fits me best? Which of them all am I? I think these are questions we start to ask the moment we learn how to ask questions. For as children seek love and acceptance from parents, acceptance in their world, they also seek it from those outside influences that determine acceptance and love outside of the home. Based on their actions or behavior, they look at themselves and say, I naturally behave in a feminine way, but I'm a boy, and I'm not a girl, so I must be a boy that is like a girl. I must like boys. So like all people, a fear they have is of rejection. Like all humankind, that fear is instilled from past experience. So it really is about the stability that comes from a sense of identity. In order to possess an acceptable level of happiness, they look for one of the paradigms of society under which they can fit, where the confrontation of rejection is not a danger, and they join that group. For some, it may not necessarily be because they even have biologically programmed same-sex attractions, but because they can be accepted in those groups as they are. They don't have to do anything differently. It is merely a way of programming themselves to fit into a world that was made before they arrived, before all of us arrived. So it is like a support group, a form or subdivision of society in which they can be loved and accepted as they are, and they finalize their meanings that they are different, and once they have created that reality mentally, it is the same as if they had been born physically and psychologically programmed to be attracted to the same sex. Those mental realities are as real and dependable as any tangible substance, and yet changeable depending on personal choice. As Tim Ferriss puts it in his book, The 4-Hour Workweek, reality is negotiable. We define our own realities by what we choose to believe as the meaning-making machines that we are. By declaring who you are and what you stand for, you establish stability in your life. Like I said, it is an identity thing. If a person were to declare him or herself as a homosexual, that person could then enjoy the strength that comes with making a decision they as a person are committed to. If a person remitted that declaration or that profession to be a certain way, that individual would again be left vulnerable, out in the open, with nothing behind him or her. I could say I was homosexual, and others in the category would readily accept me as I am, possibly more than other circles within society. Mainly, I think because that circle is looking for converts. Truly, it appears the homosexual community is more zealous for converts than the Mormon Church. I think there is a reason for that, though, and it is a beautiful reason. I think individuals with homosexual tendencies are a grade of person that is more emotionally fragile, and the homosexual community understands that, and they provide an emotional sanctuary for their brothers and sisters. I think congregations the world over could learn several things from that. Because the homosexual community is looking for converts, it is ready to accept them and support them for what they choose to stand for and be. Section 5. Fast forward 9 years to 2016. I will share an experience that provided me with many answers I had been searching for and validated many thoughts I had entertained in the writing of this essay. After sharing this experience, I will jump right back in time 9 years to my own studies. I do this because I think it critical for anyone exposed to the rainbow dialogues to understand that it was a progression of thought over many years. None of these concepts came easily or quickly, and I think it important to document the entire journey as some of my viewpoints changed along the way. I have finally started to compile all of my notes for this essay, and a dear friend invites me to a seminar on sexuality in Utah. The keynote speaker is a woman named Lisa Diamond. She is a professor at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and she has been studying sexuality as a career her entire life. She and her wife were one of the first same-sex couples to be married in the state of Utah. On a personal and professional level, she had a lot of insight into sexuality. With the word seminar, I expected a large lecture hall with stadium seating. What I discovered when I arrived at the address was much more intimate. I walked into a lovely original craftsman-style home just a few blocks south from the heart of downtown Salt Lake City, and we packed into a cozy living room, and the only person sitting between Lisa and I was the hostess of the lecture, a lovely young woman my age named Kate Kelly. A number of years ago, Kate created quite a stir inside the Mormon faith by stepping into the role as a representative of Mormon women who feel women should be allowed to hold the priesthood in the Mormon Church. Kate has made her home a hub of social issues and community involvement, which is what led to this lecture I attended. Lisa Diamond began with a one-question quiz. The legalization of gay marriage and increased acceptance will eventually lead to an increase in queer people in society. She then offered 3 options for responses to the question. A. That is ridiculous. It will not affect anything. B. More people will experiment and choose it. C. People who think B is true but don't want to be judged, so we'll go with A. Lisa asserted that it is her perception that society is giving the right of gay marriage out of sympathy by simply stating that those who feel gays have a choice and choose to be gay are hated, while those who feel gays don't have a choice are accepted out of sympathy. That they had no choice is salient. If people can't change something about themselves, it feels wrong to punish them for it. So it is a useful argument. So my friend, with whom I attended this lecture, had sat beside me, and he raised his hand and asked, "What is wrong with this argument?" Reading between the lines of his question, I gathered the unspoken statements inside it. If winning the rights of gay marriage is a war, and this argument is helping to win it, then what's the problem? So long as the argument is won, who cares if it's out of sympathy? He didn't say that, but that's what I heard packed tight inside his question. To frame her answer properly, her response began by explaining that sexuality is very fluid depending on the person. There is a spectrum upon which gay people fall in regarding choice, and culture influences where they fall. Scientifically, sometimes it isn't biology that draws people to homosexuality, and sometimes other factors affect certain people differently. There is a lot of diversity in the gay community. Many always knew they were gay, but others not so much, and have to discover it. It is validating for some to hear, "I was always this way," but for others it takes a long time to figure out. In order to understand what is wrong with the argument of giving rights to gays out of sympathy, we have to inspect the influence of bisexuality on the homosexual community. Bisexual patterns on a spectrum appear similar to a dial on a scale. On the far left side you have men, in the exact middle you have both, and at the far right you have women. There are more men who are exclusively attracted to men than women exclusively attracted to women. However, those who are attracted to both male and female outnumber both the male and female exclusives, so that there are more people in the bisexual range than any other. Using a simple Venn diagram, one circle can be drawn that represents men, and a second representing women can be drawn overlapping it. The space where they overlap occupies the greatest area. The born this way argument eventually hits a wall of a hierarchy of rights for gays. Bisexuals with fluid sexuality threaten the mainstream gay community who always knew and complicate the sexuality spectrum. Bisexuals with more complex histories than homosexuals throw a wrench in the cogs. There is a great deal of resentment inside of the LGBT movement because LGBT each stands for a group with extremely different dynamics. Each of these minorities should not have been thrown into the same group, as each has a unique narrative, and when mixed, they are in conflict with each other. Homosexuals who are born this way resent the sexual fluidity of bisexuals who have to grow into it over time. The only thing that each group does have in common is gender variance. Lisa then went on to say that the concept that we have to be an immutable group to win that argument is not true. The real argument should be having the liberty to choose regardless of any other reason. The challenge that already stands in place to oppose that liberty isn't any law, but groupthink perception of entire societies and how they view divergent behaviors of sexuality. For example, Parents who say anything against their children being gay, such as, "Can't you wear something different?" even if subtle, makes them 8 times more likely to commit suicide, and if they are girls, they have increased likelihood of getting pregnant. In the 1960s and 1970s, reparative therapy was introduced as a method to cure homosexuality. Viewing it in retrospect, logically, reparative therapy is unethical in that it influences someone to alter their choice and does so as a higher priority than doing what is best for their health. Reparative therapy was used almost purely for social reasons in an attempt to assimilate into the sexual majority. A massive amount of those social reasons stemmed from religious influence. On an elementary level, religion is the greatest enemy to societies worldwide readily accepting sexually divergent groups. The born that way argument hasn't helped get more acceptance in the Mormon Church, in the Catholic Church, or Judaism. All have taken the stance, don't act on it. Lisa next began explaining the relationship between bisexuality and the fluid sexuality by asking a question and immediately answering it. What does sexual fluidity mean? We don't know. She then added that we are figuring it out. For the first time, there is freedom to study this, so we are learning more. Up to this point in her lecture, she had covered 2 groups. The first is gays, and the second are those who are bisexual or experience sexual fluidity. Lisa explained with excitement that a 20-year study on bisexuality was coming to a close, and she waited with great anticipation to study the results of all the gathered data. Without all the data to analyze, she was still able to share a few things that she has observed. And looking at a group that is 100% gay, or 80-20 on the spectrum of bisexuality, leaning towards men, whatever the ratios may be, over time, people's attractions sexually evolve and change. Gender variant and gender minority should be used as terms to describe these groups of people, not LGBT. LGBT are labels on people that can cause discrimination, whereas sexual minority means they reside in an area that isn't easily defined, so there is more protection there. Lisa then asserted that viewing homosexuality through the born this way lens is inherently oppressive as it infers something is wrong. Instead, she argued, society should move away from that to a respect of sexual choice and autonomy. In this age of identifying with certain things, gender variant individuals fall into 3 general categories from which a great deal of statistics are derived. If filling out a form, the question would read something like this: do you identify with having a same-sex identity, same-sex behavior, or same-sex attraction? Same-sex can be replaced with transgender, bisexual, or any group for that matter, but all relate to those 3 categories of attraction, behavior, and identity. The smallest group actually identifies as gay, but they also choose to be the most visible. People who fall in the categories of attraction and behavior greatly outnumber those who identify openly as gay. Lisa then asserted that those who do identify and have come out need to stand up for those who have not or can't. There is a diversity of experience. Some knew early, others did not. There is no single experience. Lisa then presented an analogy. When someone has 2 races, a black dad, a Latina mom, we don't say, pick one. We say, you have a complex identity. She then added, I don't think it's hopeless. There has been some improvement. It's a process. The process of resolving issues of sexuality is not something reserved for gender variant groups. All of society is struggling with sexuality, and something has to give. Religions that doctrinally require their members to repress their sexual biology and bury it deep beneath the surface causes it to morph from something natural and beautiful into a black cancer that begins to spread out and reach upward till it starts to surface in the ugliest of ways, till it is impossible to hide any longer or ignore. For example, validating pleasure is not culturally acceptable in Mormon culture. Mormons don't talk about sex, but behind closed doors, they provide the largest percentage of porn subscriptions and sex toy purchases. And driving on the highway in Salt Lake City, billboards read the statistic that 1 in 5 children in Utah are sexually molested before the age of 18. Of both the majority and gender variant groups, which group's sexuality is causing the greatest damage to society? Lisa Diamond also asserted that, in her opinion, it would be great if, as kids, all children were presented with the topic of sexuality so that they can be aware that this is something of great importance that they will need to discover and know for themselves. As early as kindergarten, children can be asking themselves, am I lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? It may seem like a very complex question to ask a child, a milestone large enough to end a child's childhood. Depending on the family culture, religion, direct community, and any other number of factors, discovering the answer could really rock many people's lives. However, it is likely that gender-variant children, those who operate differently than the majority sexually, are likely asking these questions at an early age anyway. I personally feel that sex is the greatest indicator of success in a person's life. How well a person gets a handle on his or her sexuality will be the greatest determining factor for that person obtaining what he or she wants out of life and this brief period of mortality, each to his or her own turn on earth. If owning sexuality is indeed that important, is it not appropriate to provide a greater level of guidance and introduction to sexuality? In a perfect world, loving parents would monitor their children's emotional and mental development, looking for cues for appropriate times to discuss sexuality and explain it in increments till the child grew into a full awareness of sexuality and its importance on an individual level, in a small community, and how it relates to society as a whole. Alas, few human beings have had such an introduction. Television, movies, the internet, and friends at school currently provide the introduction and guidance to sexuality in society. Even with stalwart parenting worthy of praise, untraceable icebergs of influence impossible to stop run through homes every day. A parent's only hope is to be able to choose and have control of the time that a child is exposed to certain realities of sexuality. A loving hope, but naive and unrealistic in this day and age. As sexuality is the pivot point of success for individuals and societies, how noble a thing it would be to carefully and consistently guide the children of communities into their awareness of sexuality. It is something from which there is no escape in this life. Every person must learn how to deal with it, and the greater the intentionality, the greater a life can be. With the acknowledgement that this is an area that deserves attention, programs to teach and introduce children to sexuality can be created, but they should be developed and implemented on the lowest level that can do it well. Ideally, individual parents would have the opportunity to craft and contribute to the curriculum on sexuality that their children would be learning, rather than having some model generated on the federal level of education and distributed downward. Far too much variety of culture exists in the United States for a federally implemented model to accomplish the goal of guidance and introduction to sexuality without causing more harm than good. Lisa Diamond also said that what work she does and research she does in her lab and what she discovers is irrelevant to what society chooses in regards to what is allowed in relationships and sex. In her words, if it doesn't matter, then it doesn't matter. For example, during the controversial Prop 8 in the state of California, a group contested to the government that if same-sex marriage were legalized, that it would likely cause an increase in homosexuality. Government officials responded by saying that the state of California has no interest in whether the number of people with same-sex attractions increases. From a standpoint of government, obedience to established law supersedes sexuality. To date, gender variance is not an indicator of whether or not a person will be a good law-abiding citizen. From research conducted on the children of same-sex parents, children raised by same-sex parents are more likely to admit considering being gay, but statistically do not choose to be gay. What that indicates is that the ratios of children who choose to be gay are the same regardless of whether the child has same-sex parents or not. Statistically, boys experiment sexually more than girls before coming out that they are gay. With an interesting turn in the evolution of humanity, there is great urgency to resolve the issue of sexuality. The age at which young women start their periods has reached what scientists call a reproductive floor. The bodies of young girls now have the capacity to become pregnant at an alarmingly young age. This biological change is not unique to a geographic area, but is occurring across the globe. In developed countries with complex manufactured products with estrogenic plastics, the age is even lower, but as a whole, the age really cannot get any lower without compromising the life of the pregnant mother-child. That age has fallen to a range between 12 and 8 years old. Historically, young women conveniently would start their periods at the same time that their culture expected them to get married and move to a space of independence. If young girls can now become pregnant so young, it will have a massive impact on what those girls are able to do with their lives and will place a heavy burden on society. In the story of God casting Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, the act of sexual intercourse is never presented at all. And yet the conclusion of many Christian churches is that because of what happened to Adam and Eve and their fall from grace, we should feel ashamed of our sexuality. Moses never said that in the book of Genesis. That particular meaning isn't even implied, and yet that has been a dominant interpretation across Christendom. As a matter of guilty by association, merely by proximity in the story, Christians made a connection between temptation and nakedness. Sex, then, was labeled as dangerous and has been ever since. A far healthier meaning to take from the story is that shame does not have to be the destination when navigating sexuality. Overall, as a matter of human nature, societies all over the world have the tendency to seek a controlled narrative, a black and white approach, so we can find answers and conclusions. Unfortunately, with all of the contributing factors, each with its own weight of pull and influence, when studied under a microscope, it is impossible to ever simplify it to just black and white. It will never be black and white. It's a full rainbow. Consciences differ as much as personality, and each has to navigate his or her own comfort level with sexuality. A true challenge to any intimate relationship is to find a balance and honor the other partner's comfort level. What is comfortable for one person sexually may be across the line for another. Feeling shame, then, isn't all bad, but a guidepost to conscience to indicate when a person has gone too far. Upon striking those conscience chords, a partner can say, "No, I don't feel comfortable with that." When it comes to exploring sexuality with another person, it is difficult to know where the line is until you have crossed it. The Mormon Church dictates where the line is before marriage, but not much direction after that. The sexuality line that the Church draws in the sand is simple. Exercise complete self-control through celibacy until marriage, and stay faithful to that one person sexually till death do you part. The church culture pushes its youth to marry young, with the unspoken expectation that once married, the two young partners have a responsibility to each other to assist each other when it comes to navigating each other's sexuality. The church is completely hands-off for giving any type of guidance for how to do that. It opts to only provide general principles and allow people to govern themselves. Navigating sexuality is difficult without a coach, and yet that is where young Mormon married couples find themselves, going from complete self-control sexually as a single person to being married with no direction at all for what to do, which leaves young married couples at the mercy of sex advice that comes from their family cultures. Mankind has great reason to exercise discipline and self-control when it comes to sexuality, which makes it natural to feel ashamed when falling short of the goal. The argument then is the question, are the expectations too high? When morality is a defining component in a free society retaining its ability to govern itself, it is in the best interest of society to have high standards. Is there a way to retain the morality of a society while simultaneously opening the doors to exploring sexuality? Is there a way to retain the morality of a society while simultaneously opening the doors to exploring sexuality? As sexuality is a powerful driving force at younger and younger ages, it is a force that has to be reckoned with. It cannot be ignored. The Mormon Church teaches that no man or woman can be saved in ignorance, and thus the best policy is that of education. What the curriculum will be and who is in control of its delivery is of paramount importance. If done right, I believe societies will be able to retain their morality and even level up, to operate on a level of wisdom that hasn't happened before in recorded history. But it can't happen without a component of education on sexuality that rises to the same level of importance in schools as reading, writing, and math. It is, in my opinion, that middle school is the ideal time for those conversations to start. That is when the sex flame ignites of its own accord. Before that, there is an innocence and curiosity in sex and sexuality, but not a need to know how to deal with it. At middle school, the need comes alive. It is my hope that a semester of sexual education class be mandatory once a year from 7th grade through 12th grade, and that the curriculum be sent to parents in advance, and that the curriculum is designed by licensed sex professionals to deliberately involve the parents in what is being taught in the classrooms, by having parents come as guests during the semester with a curriculum that provides parents prompts and questions to the parents, with teachers and licensed professionals acting as mediators in the class discussions. For something as important as sexuality, the curriculum cannot come from the top down and successfully transform a society into one that lacks shame and retains its morality. To break into a space that transcends embarrassment of the topic and requires and commands maturity, parents must be involved in the conversation. The diversity of methodology for how different households have navigated or are still navigating their sexuality will provide a more accurate understanding of how complex and nuanced sexuality is, and it will be a perspective and a view that a solely state-sponsored education cannot accomplish on its own. Section 6. Back to 2007. Driving change. Shaming people, or in other words, using political correctness as a tool to place people in a space where fear of backlash prevents them from standing up and voicing a difference of opinion, has stagnated an exchange of ideas from progressing. The fear of being unpopular and feeling inferior prevents people from standing up and a dialogue taking place. As a Mormon, I have been raised to expect hatred, as persecution is really the only heritage any Mormon can count on. I embarked on the journey of writing this essay with the knowledge that what I discovered could place me at odds against my own religion, but as a result of my conditioning, I chose to press onward regardless of which direction the backlash comes. As a result of the opinions I have formed as a result of my research and meditation, I anticipate the backlash to come from all sides. Opinions I have formed will upset and disappoint the liberal and conservative alike. Section 7. Sexuality and integrity. As a result of the evolution of divorce law, society places a steep punishment to both sides involved in a divorce for failing to participate in the marriage model to the expectations of the institution. If these laws continue to penalize failing marriages so harshly over the next couple hundred years and 1,000 years beyond that, I anticipate that marriage will dissolve altogether, as there is no incentive to participate in the institution, as the financial and emotional risk is not worth doing so. Moving forward, I predict a similar equivalent of marriage will emerge that exists outside of spaces inhabited by social law that are instead based on integrity alone. Marriage itself is an institution based on integrity, where a commitment is made to uphold a structure of social stability. This commitment is made not only to spouses, but to a couple's community. Because of the formal nature of marriage, it is easy for law to enforce it, but also when marriages fail, the same law can be leveraged and used as a weapon to wage war between former spouses with any offspring falling as collateral damage, as they are traumatized by the warfare they have witnessed occur on the battleground of their own homes between their parents. Divorce law grants access to an arsenal of powerful weapons that are a release to damaged feelings, and as such, this access to encouraged expression only amplifies the animosity, giving it wings, which consequentially increases the damage inflicted on the relationships as well as the damage inflicted on the children, often moving them into a space of disillusionment in regards to relationships. In the 1970s, half of marriages ended in divorce. If that statistic has remained the same, then half of the children of this nation approach relationships from a space of post-divorce disillusionment. I grew up with a simple understanding of integrity, which was that you need to keep your word, and if you committed to do something, that you would do it. Later, in entering the real world, I learned that holding to this model of integrity doesn't work in many situations, as it is missing an element of communication. Personality changes daily because outside stimuli are in constant flux. Circumstances change just as rapidly, which alters original agreements. The only way that things can conclude favorably is to use communication to explain the changes and to expand the original agreement to include the changes, which may result in both parties abandoning the agreement altogether, as that may be the most favorable course in considering all of the options, which feels like a breach of integrity under my original understanding of integrity, but it isn't at all. Relationships, especially intimate ones, are the epitome of ever-changing stimuli, circumstances, and personalities. The only realistic way for intimate relationships to survive is to employ the communication side of integrity. Consequently, that model can also be responsible for both sides to conclude that considering the changes, the original agreements they made to each other also by necessity must change, and with the changes the couple is no longer compatible, and the only conclusion is to abandon the original agreement altogether and each other. Is this scenario a breach of integrity? So long as communication was employed all the way through, and the changes are not a surprise to either party, then in my opinion, there is no breach of integrity. If a lover were to suddenly approach her counterpart and say, "I don't love you anymore, I want a divorce," with no cause or warning, then a breakdown in communication and thus integrity has taken place. If communication is employed consistently to communicate regular changes of perceptions and ideas as a result of exposure to outside stimuli and experiences, a lover's partner has the opportunity to choose to change with his lover, and if neither sees things the same, she also can choose to alter her viewpoint to fall in closer alignment to his. It is when no communication has occurred that a lover's partner is robbed of the opportunity to choose, and in truth, both are robbed of the opportunity to choose, as one holding back his inner thoughts does so because he does not want to change, or via discussion, change his mind, or by discussion, discover he was wrong. Another reason that deters communication is fear of conflict, or fear that the thoughts one is having are by nature a breach of the original agreement. The opposite is true. If he holds back and does not communicate, then he has or is breaking his integrity by robbing himself and his lover of the opportunity to expand the agreement to include whatever changes are occurring in either side of the relationship. It is true that a person's success in life can be measured by the number of hard conversations he or she is willing to have. This is especially true in terms of success in relationships. Under my original understanding of integrity, integrity is broken most often in relationships as changes are not communicated in an effort to honor the original agreement no matter what it takes, holding in changes till they build up so great that they are impossible to contain any longer, too often conclude with, "I don't love you anymore, I want a divorce." Section 8. Natural Law. In studying homosexuality, it has stumped me. It is a puzzle piece that does not fit into the current model of religion. Neither can be right at the same time. One of them has to bend to the other. This is true of several other religions, including Islam. It makes sense then that historically and even recently that homosexuality is punishable by death in Islamic religions because it is abrasive to the workings of the greater machine and thus by nature begs to be rubbed out. As a threat, possibly the greatest threat to the religion, it has been received with zero tolerance. Though its approach is more diplomatic, the Mormon Church has opted for a similar course. Recognizing the incompatibility of the two, the Mormon Church has non-threateningly asserted that if you are a practicing homosexual, that Mormonism isn't for you, even if you believe it's true. But as a requisite by society, the Mormon Church states that homosexuals can be active members of the Mormon Church only if they do not practice homosexuality. That is both unreasonable and unrealistic, as sexuality is wired into our biology. It cannot be turned off. It is as unreasonable and unrealistic to ask heterosexual married couples to stop having sex. A war against biology is a difficult one to win indeed. How fair is that to ask of anyone? To withhold one's biology is to sentence them to a life of internal struggle and self-sacrifice for what is supposedly in the best interest of the rest of society. Sacrifice yourself so that I can go on living normally as I have all my life. That is a lot to ask of anyone. Section 9. Full sexual fluidity. After a discussion with a friend, I came to a better understanding of what an adoption of full sexual fluidity might look like. To illustrate this, imagine that on the spectrum of sexuality, full sexual fluidity stands at the furthest right side and marriage stands at the furthest left side. Looking into the early origins of humanity, marriage came into existence as a matter of maintaining order, but can appropriately then be labeled as both tribal and prehistoric. The earliest forms of marriage were first implemented as a way of determining succession of leaders from one chief to another. Who is to succeed the king if there is no way of knowing which of all the sons born to different mothers is the oldest or most worthy to inherit the throne? Even if that king continued to have sex with multiple women or concubines after he married, the children born to his wife would take precedence over the others. Now, technology and sex education have reached a point that marriage is no longer necessary at all. To fully embrace the practice of sexual fluidity common to the homosexual community, long-term intimate relationships would by necessity have to be something that is voluntarily released. If sexual experiences were described in terms of food, and a person lived in a rich melting pot such as the United States of America, it is ludicrous to think that a person would by choice go his or her entire life only eating Chinese food or any other one type of cuisine for that matter. But in terms of diet, most people eat many types of cuisine. In terms of sex, cuisine can be defined by nationality, skin color, hair color, eye color, creating access to far more variety than can ever be found in food. For an exciting diet in terms of sexuality, it can be argued that as men and women are physically attracted to more than one person, it should be socially acceptable for a woman to abruptly end her physical relationship with one man and immediately begin one with another. Physical and sexual attractiveness would then become the compass for knowing how long someone should be in an intimate relationship. Alternatively, it indicates that people should have the freedom socially to depend on one person for a number of needs. Alternatively, it indicates that people should have the freedom socially to depend on one person for a number of needs, while depending on any person he or she chooses for sexual fulfillment. While it is natural to be attracted to more than one person, the commitment to sexuality as prescribed by some homosexuals encourages people to follow that attraction and to fulfill it. And in that way, they never have to wonder sexually what it is like to have sex with a redhead, or a Bavarian, or someone from the Mediterranean. Sexual curiosity is traded for sexually fulfilled satisfaction. Satiating sexual needs would be considered separately from romance and treated in an entirely different way. Satisfying a sexual appetite independent of romantic intimacy would logically require some type of formal agreement, not unlike a business contract, in which the transaction of sex would be an entirely formal agreement, including what either party was and was not willing to exchange. Having approached a sexual relationship with such a contract beforehand, severing the relationship at any point in time would likely be included in the contract, enabling either party to pursue other territory at any time. Like eating food, afterwards a person can say, "That wasn't what I was expecting, but I liked it. What should I try next time?" At this date and time in society, sex and food are not treated the same. But if sexuality is viewed as a fluid thing that fluctuates throughout a person's life, and to follow and explore that fluctuation, then that viewpoint can change. If a book were written with the title "How to Avoid Murder" or "Being Murdered for Dummies," it would only be a single line long and would read, "Don't cheat on your significant other." Because sexual commitment to one person is the hallmark and pinnacle example of fidelity in our society, when that commitment is broken, it is the deepest way to offend someone. It is also one of the most embarrassing and demeaning of failures, which all too often is excruciatingly public and visible. Even so, that failure is commonplace in society, which admittedly is a good indicator that the current model isn't working very well. It can easily be argued that by adopting a more sexually fluid approach to relationships, that relationship-related murders could be drastically reduced, if not eliminated altogether. While much could be discussed regarding this topic of socially adopting a new model of sexuality, as an adult, I can hear much of the dialogue and nod in agreement with many of the points as they logically make sense. But as soon as I have had children and I have personally observed their development and how desperately they need the consistent attention of my wife and I have to disagree with the adoption of fluid sexuality. While it may work for consenting adults, it is not compatible with raising healthy, emotionally stable children. Many might argue that marriage and people failing in their marriages create just as much emotional damage and unstable children, but I side with the opposing argument that fluid sexuality would wreak more havoc on children. In order for children to be raised in a healthy environment, if the parents continued to live into a commitment of full sexual fluidity, the parents would have to hide it from their children. It is my belief that that type of instability is not compatible with raising healthy children. I acknowledge another argument can easily counter mine, asserting that parents hide their sexual relationship from their children also, and keep their intimacy a secret till the children prove ready for a conversation about the birds and the bees. While consenting adults could form an experiment to prove me wrong, using children as lab rats strikes me as a significant risk indeed. I have personally witnessed more than one gay friend employ the approach of full sexual fluidity, and I have to admit that it works extremely well for each that does. It is an empowering way to approach their sexuality in which they feel complete control. These friends are doing impressive things with their lives and using their talents and resources to help a lot of people, and I personally believe that they have related. How powerfully they approach life is a direct result of the grasp they have on their own sexuality. However, if anyone practicing full sexual fluidity reached a point that he or she wanted to have children, it is my opinion that full sexual fluidity should be traded for a model of commitment for the sake of the child's stability and health. Sexuality defines societies. Societies and their stability depends on the sexuality of the individuals that constitute it. A stable sexuality makes for a stable nation, and a nation with a shaky grasp on sexuality will be unstable indeed. In the past, a strong moral discipline determined whether or not a society could establish a firm grasp of sexuality. That self-control and discipline, while still respected, is being replaced with technology and sex education. It is likely that people in the United States have sex just as much as people in underdeveloped countries. However, every person in the United States has access to birth control pills, condoms, and operative procedures to rein in the natural consequences of having sex. As a result, most Americans have solid control of when they get pregnant and how many children they have, while in underdeveloped countries, they have no such luxury and their populations provide the evidence. Having a firm grip on sexuality so that it is under the control in one's life is what will determine that person's long-term contributions to society, regardless of whether that person is homosexual or heterosexual. Owning sexuality in a conscious, intentional way empowers individuals who attack their life purpose with inexhaustible passion. From what I have observed, because homosexuals process sexuality differently than heterosexuals, they are forced to throw their entire selves into the exploration of sexuality as a matter of self-preservation, and out of integrity have an honest discussion with it. What is commendable, as it takes courage, is that they share the conclusions or evidence of their experiments with the world. For most homosexuals I personally know, their sexuality is in overdrive in comparison to mine. They seem to have a heightened sense and need for it. If there were a dial to indicate sex drive, my guess is that for most homosexuals, that dial is set at least a few notches higher than the average heterosexual. A safe guess considering that many homosexual men are willing to defy laws against homosexuality and even risk death in order to have sex with another man. Some heterosexual men are willing to break laws to have sex with another woman, hence the existence of red light districts, but I don't know of many men who are willing to risk their lives to have sex with a woman. I think that the conclusions or findings made by the homosexual community in their exploration of sexuality may well indeed be insightful to the rest of society, but those findings may also be impossible for the majority of society to implement, as most heterosexuals in every society spend the majority of their lives committed to one person for an extended period of time. Section 10, written in 2008, Subgroups and Unity. Are there subgroups in the homosexual community? Why would knowing that be important? What is the relevance of making the determination that there is more than one group in the homosexual community? To me, it is important to ask that to figure out how much unity there is in the minority regarding aspects of relationships, such as faithfulness or monogamy. The bottom line is that homosexuals are people, just like heterosexuals, and that it is likely that there is just as much diversity inside the minority of homosexuals as there is in the majority of society that makes up heterosexuals. However, for the sake of making points that are poignant, I am going to make generalizations. Generalizations suck because they are so general, but they assist in simplifying things for the sake of clarity. I'm going to use generalizations to paint pictures. I am an artist after all, regardless of the risk of what the images will show, so hate on. I have thought about this a long time. Thought about what? I've been thinking about the topic of homosexuality a long time. Why? I'm a Mormon and have a genuine interest in other people and a sincere interest in the interests of others. Who cares? Tons of people claim the same thing every day, I am sure. Well, I, like many people, have good friends who have come out of the closet, and without skipping a beat, I decided to support them in their decision in order to preserve my relationship with them, because they are important to me. I bet most people are in this same boat. So there is that, but then there is this clash caused by traditional Christian teachings about homosexuality and the titan that is the minority of homosexuals, and this clash has millions of people in conflict doing their best to make sense of it all. They don't want to judge their friends, but they don't want to go to hell either. So it is a nice little struggle we have going on here. No good solutions in sight. The best out on the horizon to date are the labels bigots and sinners. So we have to be on the right track, right? I hope not. I think we can do better. I believe we can. I believe we should. Section 11. If there are subgroups in the homosexual minority, what are they? Okay, so after much deliberation, studying the history of homosexual behavior in the Bible, as well as in other books recognized as scripture by the Mormon Church, my conclusion is that this era of homosexuals is different than any other era of homosexuals in the history of the world. My bottom line conclusion is that the Christian world has no reason to fear this era of homosexuals, while on the other hand, from stories recorded in Scripture, those ancient peoples had every reason to fear the homosexual counterparts of their day. I think the greatest difference is culture, and the second greatest difference is good laws. Mormons are the ones currently labeled as the bigots. Since I am on this side of the line drawn in the sand, I will be the one who does his best to offer a level of understanding from this side of the line. I'm going to give a brief summary of two stories of homosexuality believed by the Mormon Church to paint a picture of how fearful and apprehensive the Mormons are of homosexuality in general. The Mormons have two other books that they believe are also Holy Scripture, apart from the Book of Mormon. One is called the Doctrine and Covenants, and the other is called the Pearl of Great Price. For those who possess an interest in the study of religion, the Pearl of Great Price provides the foundation of some of the most fascinating ideas and doctrines. In the Pearl of Great Price resides the Book of Moses. In chapter 5, there is a brief story about a descendant of Cain named Lamech. In this story, it explains how Cain started a secret society that lasted several generations. At this time, there are two groups of people, the sons of Adam and the sons of men. The sons of Adam are those who follow the teachings of Father Adam, and the sons of men are those who don't. Lamech is a member of this secret society, and a relative named Irad starts to share secrets about the society with the sons of Adam. So in order to protect the secrets under the oath, Lamech kills Irad. So one of the secrets of the secret society is that they all practiced homosexuality. At some point, Lamech confides the secret of homosexuality to his two wives, and they don't like the news one bit. They tell everyone about it, and Lamech is exiled and lives in hiding from both groups. He hides from members of the secret society because he broke his oath to secrecy, and he hides from the sons of Adam because he murdered Irad. To wrap things up, in verse 55, we learn that during this period, homosexuality spread among those who were not the sons of Adam. So the takeaway from this story from Mormons is that homosexuality can become a common practice of secret societies, which hold loyalty and keeping oaths in high regard, high enough that they are willing to kill to keep them secret. With the assurance that history repeats itself, though unspoken, Mormons feel that if it can happen once, it can happen again. The second story is one common to all Christendom. It is a story of Lot and the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. While some crucial details may have been lost to the historians that recorded the tale, this is a disturbing story any way you try to look at it. Any fool can read this history and ascertain its primary components. I enjoy reading fiction, so for the purposes of making more sense of the story of Lot, let's take some liberties and add some world building to this scenario so that it makes more sense. Let's assume that the city government of Sodom has thrived into a civilization of advanced philosophy. As a result, they confront questions of sexuality, and basing their decisions primarily on logic, they rule in favor of civil rights over freedom of religion. At the time, freedom of religion hadn't been invented yet, so choosing civil rights really was the only available choice. Let's give the city of Sodom some slack and say that they passed a law making rape illegal. However, at a certain time of night, gangs of men practicing full sexual fluidity roam the streets in search of an untested sexual experience. These gangs grow so large in size and power that people don't stay on the streets at night, and lock their doors hoping that they aren't visited, knowing full well that if called upon, no one will help them. In a high-concept logline, it's the movie The Purge combined with homosexuality. Admittedly, there are not enough details explaining the history of the city government, but ultimately no governing body stood to oppose a large group of men from roaming the streets in search of an untested sexual experience, and these men's right to test their sexuality outweighed the religious stance of their victims to not partake. Having covered these two stories, my main question then is this. Inside of the minority of homosexuals in the United States today, is there a group of them that are still like the secret society of Lamech, or like the men of Sodom and Gomorrah? If it can be proven that there are no such groups in the homosexual communities today, then I think the majority of anxiety felt by all Christians surrounding this issue can be alleviated and dispersed completely. Section 12. Innate or choice? Several years ago now, Justin Bieber unwittingly got caught in the middle of the born this way and lifestyle choice argument inside the homosexual community. If all homosexuals chose to be homosexual, then it is a lifestyle choice. But if all homosexuals are born that way and there is nothing they can do about it, then it isn't a lifestyle choice at all. It is a way of being. People treat the two differently. I have more sympathy for those who are born that way, whereas my sympathy dissolves when people choose homosexuality as a lifestyle. I feel it is important that they have the freedom to do whatever it is they want with their lives, but I don't feel an obligation to protect them as I do if they are born that way. Instead, I think, hey, that's cool if that's what you want to do, but you're on your own. This is an old argument inside the issue of homosexuality. Are people born with same-gender attraction, or is it something people choose? The bold stance of former Justice of the Utah Supreme Court, Dallin H. Oaks, who is currently a member of the 12 Apostles in the Mormon Church, is that God would not do that to his children. God would not place same-gender attractions on any of his children as something they were born with. Elder Oaks is about as bold as any man ever was. I imagine it comes from habit from his occupation in life. He states everything as a matter of fact. To him, everything is black and white. He doesn't mince words, and he doesn't apologize. How many judges do? I wrestled with the choice to agree with Dallin H. Oaks for years, but after a long time I chose to be true to my own conscience and what I felt to be right. So one of my first stances is that I disagree with Elder Oaks, and as politely as possible declare that he is very naive for making such a bold claim regarding same-gender attraction, especially being a man of his intellect. All of the members of the 12 Apostles that make up the leadership of the Mormon Church are highly educated. Many of them come from Ivy League colleges in varying areas of expertise. As an understatement, they are not ignorant or small-thinking men. I am surprised at the stance they have taken, knowing the type of men they are. But as leaders of an international religion, I believe they are staying on safe ground from a doctrinal standpoint, regardless of the opposition or backlash. That stalwart disposition is as courageous as anything, considering the momentum behind the opposition. So to introduce my first generalizations, I am declaring that there are two initial groups in the homosexual community. Group A will be homosexuals that are born with same-sex attractions, and Group B will be individuals that have no previous disposition to same-sex relationships, but for whatever reason choose to be homosexual. So one group is born that way, and the other group chooses to be that way. Section 13, written in 2009. Are homosexual tendencies a deformity, or are they following a blueprint? To juxtapose this question, I will refer to some philosophy by Cicero regarding natural law. Explained crudely, if something is not in the best interest of the whole, that something is eradicated. In many cases, it rubs itself out. When something upsets the function of a system, by justice and for the welfare and survival of the system, the disruptor must be erased. The concept is that nature functions this way and that human laws mirror nature, thus following the same pattern. So referring back to my narrative on Lamech, that story took place when Adam and Eve would have still been alive. So assuming that story is true for a moment, and that all mankind originated from Adam and Eve, that would mean that from the second generation of humanity, homosexuality has been part of our history. So in aligning homosexuality with natural law, if homosexuality was something that was against the grain and was something that disrupted the system, then it would eventually get rubbed out. But it is still here. So for me, that begs the question, is homosexuality contrary to natural law? If it isn't, then it must be part of natural law, meaning that it serves a purpose inside of nature that other areas of nature obviously cannot provide. So how does homosexuality serve the greater whole? Perhaps the evolutionary thinking of humankind has been behind the curve of nature, and it has taken until now for humankind to reach a level of intelligence to actually reside in resonance with nature in regards to homosexuality. Possibly it has taken humankind as a species till now to be able to consciously identify how homosexuality can be beneficial to the whole rather than as a threat. So returning to this question about a blueprint, I'm going to explain some doctrines of the Mormon Church. Here is an excerpt from a document containing the Mormon Church's position on the definition of a family and the type of family the Church is committed to preserving. All human beings, male and female, are created in the image of God. Each is a beloved spirit son or daughter of heavenly parents, and, as such, each has a divine nature and destiny. Gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose. In the premortal realm, spirit sons and daughters knew and worshipped God as their eternal Father and accepted His plan by which His children could obtain a physical body and gain earthly experience. Jump to Abraham 3:21. Now the Lord has shown unto me, Abraham, the intelligences that were organized before the world was, and among all these there were many of the noble and great ones. Jump to Moses 3:5. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For I, the Lord God, created all things of which I have spoken, spiritually, before they were naturally upon the face of the earth. For I, the Lord God, had not caused it to rain upon the face of the earth. And I, the Lord God, had created all the children of men, and not yet a man to till the ground. For in heaven created I them, and they were not yet flesh upon the earth, neither in the water, neither in the air. So based on these scriptures comes the doctrine that all creatures are made up of different grades of intelligence, and it does not specify whether or not He created these intelligences, or if they, like Himself, were entities that had always been. But Mormon doctrine asserts that He created spirit bodies that these intelligences could then reside inside. Once God had made these spirit bodies, that is when those individuals who He made spirit bodies for became His children, and He became their heavenly Father. As raw intelligences, we belonged to no one. A zygote of any species of creature appear nearly identical through several stages of development, and only after several weeks or months can anyone guess as to what the creature will become. In comparing the fetus of a bat, giraffe, or human, no one can tell them apart or tell you which one will become which. So how does one know to become one and not the other? Where does that blueprint come from, and how is it read? In considering the doctrine of the Mormon Church, God designed the blueprint of every living thing based on how great or noble it was. So in assuming that doctrine is true, are spirit bodies designed to the innate characteristics of an intelligence, or do physical bodies develop following the blueprint of our spiritual bodies? Or is there a margin of error in how physical bodies read the blueprint as they develop in the womb of their mothers? Biologically speaking, the primary purpose of the human body is to reproduce. There are many people born with all kinds of physical defects, and some of them are frequent enough to be represented by percentages. For example, 1 of 700 babies are born with Down syndrome, As reproduction is the primary purpose of the human body, is it possible that homosexuality is a defect or deformity, as is Down syndrome? As meaning-making machines, I think that most people would consider having a defect or deformity as part of their identity as a negative thing. A negative meaning is not the only one that people could choose, but I think that most people would arrive there, even though there is nothing that says they have to or should. I have now set up the versus match. I have framed it. Is homosexuality a defect that people are born with at birth? Said in another way, were there hereditary traits in the father or mother or environment for the fetus that prevented the fetus from reading the blueprint correctly? Or are their bodies simply following the blueprint of their spirit bodies that were designed by God? What if the spirits of homosexuals are indeed reading the blueprint perfectly? What if there is a very unique grade of intelligence that are different than the majority, and the homosexual community is a result of a physical body doing its absolute best to read the blueprint accurately? What would Elder Dallin H. Oaks say to that? We already know. The stance of the leaders of the Mormon Church, based on their understanding of our divine nature, is that God would not do that to his children. Well, has a prophet ever been wrong before? Yeah, like every single one ever, except maybe Abraham. Abraham is the only prophet in the history of the Bible and any written scripture that never sinned against God. Every other prophet made at least one mistake. What does that mean? That means that men of God are fallible. No way, perish the thought. There is no way that our religious teachers would lead us astray. Some have and some do, unfortunately. While some men may be called of God, or feel it is their calling in life to serve God, there are times that the man gets in the way of the calling. Is it possible in this case? Section 14. You don't typically wake up after a hangover with signed adoption papers. Brian Ingham. Heterosexual couples can get pregnant on accident, and those who are addicted to alcohol or drugs still have the child though unfit as parents, and for some reason, any issues or anger those unfit parents have towards themselves for not choosing a more responsible alternative for the life of their child, take those angers out on the child through abuse. Heterosexual partners have children on accident all the time, whereas homosexual partners can never get pregnant accidentally. They have to put a lot of effort and a lot of money to be able to have a child and raise that child, so they have to really want it. No one goes through months of paperwork and pays tens of thousands of dollars to adopt a child on accident. If everyone had to go through the legal process to adopt their own children before they gave birth to them, then all of the unfit parents in the world, homosexual and heterosexual both, would rule themselves out of parenthood. So the argument here is that same-sex couples that go through the trouble to be parents are a caliber of person that will most likely be good parents because they are already deeply committed. One of my first questions around homosexuality when I first started to formulate this essay 6 years ago was around gays adopting children. I will be honest, I started doing research completely expecting to discover that children raised by same-gender parents either all turned out to be gay or they would struggle in society. Why did I expect that? Because I felt that if being heterosexual was the right way and being homosexual was wrong, that there would be observable evidence to support that. As I found studies on the topic, I was surprised, but not disappointed, to find the opposite on both points. Why was I not disappointed? I wasn't disappointed because if same-gender couples were raising children just as well as heterosexual couples, that meant that they must be normal people. In retrospect, I shake my head at how horrible it was for me to think that homosexuals would be inferior parents. I have to say, though, that thinking that way did not come from my home environment. I never remember having a conversation about homosexuality with my parents. It never happened. All of my perceptions on homosexuality were developed inside of me by society, by kids at school and friends talking about it, and even movies, but never at church. If same-sex gender parents are raising healthy, stable children, then they must be normal people, which means that they should be treated normally, just like everyone else. That was my conclusion. What is yours? I wanted to know, is it better that kids that no one would adopt could be raised by a gay couple that would raise the child and love the child that otherwise would be in foster care till age 18 and who knows where after that? But what about heterosexual people who want to adopt? Say they want to, and there are not enough kids to go around after all the same-gender couples adopt theirs. Then I ask this question, should adoption by gay or straight couples be on a first-come, first-served basis? Or should the straight couples be given the first pick and gays get what's left? Now, homosexuality doesn't work for me personally, but that doesn't sound right to me, that one group or people be given more preference and privilege over another. That led me to this conclusion. I need to know more about how children raised by homosexuals turn out, how functional they are as human beings. There are studies on it, but not many. There are likely hundreds of thousands of same-sex couples that are raising children that could have participated in the studies that for whatever reason did not. After a month or two of research, my conclusion was that there really isn't enough data to analyze to be able to form any conclusions on whether raising children in a home with same-gender parents is a negative thing, but that was the bias. I was looking for data that would support the stance that it was a negative thing. In regards to individual cases, there was evidence of several same-gender couples who sucked at parenting and messed up their kids, but there are even more out there of couples that were wonderful parents and did a great job raising their kids. I think the same can be said of heterosexual couples. The ratios are roughly the same. From there, the only solution that makes sense to me is to gather more data, and the only way to do that is to allow same-gender couples to raise children and to not inhibit it. I think between 50 to 100 years of gathering data is the only way of knowing the long-term effects that the homosexual community will have on society as a whole. After that much time has passed, if it were determined by the data that homosexual couples raising children has a negative effect on society, it would be as impossible to stop as unfit heterosexual parents having children. And that way, it would level the playing field, so to speak. If same-gender parents or heterosexual parents were unfit to raise children, there are laws and organizations in place already that remove children from unhealthy and unsafe environments. So in every way, same-gender couples would be treated the same as heterosexual couples. I ran into an old friend who at the time was still a principal at a high school, who was also super conservative, and in explaining some of the current challenges facing him, he said there was one young lady currently in the high school whose parents were lesbians, and she was having a really hard time, and her behavior was facilitating a lot of one-on-one time with him. That's my way of saying she was being super rebellious and getting into trouble. She blamed all of her woes on her parents. In listening to him, all I could think was that she was like many of the friends I had in high school, who rebelled against their parents as they struggled to figure out the world. Only this young lady used the unique nature of her parents' relationship as the scapegoat. She blamed all her problems on the fact that her parents were lesbians. From the outside looking in, it struck me as a very typical behavior for a teenager, and that the problem might not be the parents at all. Maybe her parents really are the issue. I suppose only time will tell. It is 2016, and in regards to homosexuality, it is just like we went back in time to the 1960s and are dealing with racism with African Americans. We are in a civil rights war again. While many have worked for decades to shed light on this issue, now that it is under the spotlight and everyone is finally talking about it, it feels very new. Returning to natural law, consider this. What if, just what if nature has intended for homosexual couples who can't have children to raise the children of couples who have children but don't want them? How close are those ratios? What ratios? The ratio of unfit parents who don't want their children to homosexual couples that do want to raise children. It would be fascinating to me to know how close those ratios are. Regardless, same-sex couples could alleviate immeasurable pain in society by raising children in a healthy environment who otherwise are denied that luxury. Or is it a right? Section 15. The New Popularity Contest. There are roughly the same number of homosexuals in the United States as there are Mormons in the entire world. As over half of all Mormons do not live in the United States, the homosexual community outnumbers the Mormon population at least 2 to 1. Once you factor in all the other members of the LGBT and then include every nation, not just the United States, then Mormons are hopelessly outnumbered. Though the homosexual community outnumbers Mormons, even in a voting scenario, Mormons have been painted as the rival. The Mormons are the punching bag that has been chosen to be made an example of, even though it is a tiny minority when compared to the LGBT community worldwide. Just to make a quick point, Proposition 8 was voted on in the state of California, and it was a highly controversial vote that shattered lifetime friendships for thousands. It was a remarkably close vote, but ultimately the majority voted against same-sex marriage, which surprised everyone. During the entire campaign for and against Prop 8, a picture was painted that the Mormons were responsible for all of the opposition against same-sex marriage, when in fact it was statistically impossible for that to be true. The majority of those who voted against same-sex marriage in California were not Mormon. There are more than twice as many people in the state of California as there are Mormons in the world. There are about 780,000 Mormons in the state of California, which constitutes just under 2% of the entire population, which means that 50.27% of voters of 52.24% were not Mormon. 47.76% voted against it. I have presented these numbers to illustrate that there is a massive misconception happening in our country right now. Media and the homosexual community are portraying Mormons as the ones preventing all of the progress regarding rights for those with same-gender attractions. Mormons are the ones being painted as the bad guys. It seems that the Mormon Church is depicted as a giant that must be defeated in order for rights for homosexuals to have victory. The fact of the matter is, based on numbers, is that the Mormon Church is one of the smallest Daniels out there, especially in terms of religion. Islam and Catholicism are the most notable Goliaths of religion. So why is the Mormon Church being singled out? The Mormon Church is accustomed to being hated and has no qualms about taking a bold stance, even if it is highly unpopular. The Mormon Church makes it easy to be singled out on purpose, because the leaders of the Mormon Church feel that in regards to this issue, they are obligated to make where they stand clear. It is unpopular to disagree with same-sex marriage, and it is popular to go along with giving marriage rights to gays. The entire dynamic of social acceptance and rejection has been turned on its head and reversed, so that those in opposition to rights for gays are the ones that are shunned and alienated. It feels to me as if gays are shouting, "How does it feel to have a taste of your own medicine?" To which the majority of Mormons seem to just shrug and reply, "Are you kidding? We're Mormons. We've never been liked, so we're just going to keep doing our thing." And that just pisses off everyone. Section 16. Relative to what? Elder Jeffrey R. Holland on one occasion said, in effect, that in a loving relationship between a man and a woman, a sexual relationship teamed with a healthy non-sexual relationship can extend beyond the emotional, beyond the physical. It becomes in a way spiritual, but even beyond that, it is difficult to put into words that connection that is possible, but it is truly remarkable, absolutely present, and undeniably real. For homosexuals, I will assume that same connection takes place. One may say, because they are not of the opposite sex, it can't be the same, that there is no comparison. So I say this: since a homosexual person has never felt an attraction of the opposite sex and finds a partner of the same sex, and the two form a good friendship, and through their own intimacy form a similar connection mentioned by Elder Holland, even if it isn't the same feeling, because those two individuals have felt no attraction to the opposite sex, there is no way they could have made a connection like the one mentioned by Elder Holland. So this connection made and felt between these two people of the same sex would be the strongest thing each has ever felt. So since the two haven't experienced what Elder Holland explained with a member of the opposite sex, they would have nothing to compare their present connection to. Thus, there is no way that they can know which is stronger, what they have compared to what couples of the opposite sex have. So, because it is the best they have ever had, in their minds, it is just as good as what married males and females have. Surely it is just as strong, just as real. Who is anyone to say otherwise? In a conversation with another conservative, he argued that God says his plan can only work with a husband and a wife, a male and a female based family unit to rear children. God's purpose for us, one of them anyway, is to raise families. No wonder then that even homosexual couples at a certain point want to raise a child. So my argument is that despite their handicap of not being able to have children, several homosexuals still have desires to be part of a family, to have a family, and to raise a family. That is good that they have those desires. Like I covered already, a fear of straight Christian educated America is that if a homosexual community is condoned socially, that society will eventually function like the ancient biblical society of Sodom and Gomorrah. The difference between then and now that makes a huge difference is the culture, government, laws, and country where it is taking place. Case in point, take a look over at Afghanistan. Things haven't really changed over there since that story was written. Even though atheists may not like it, the fact of the matter is that the USA was founded on the Ten Commandments. While it is argued that religion is not responsible for the goodness inside of people, it is my opinion that a foundation of morality built on the Ten Commandments is an excellent way to start. This country is a moral and ethics-based country. The high majority of modern America is religious. Knowing that, I feel it's safe to assume that likewise the majority of homosexual America was raised in religious households. For the large number of those with Christian backgrounds, I imagine homosexuals have a love and a deep respect for the principles and morals taught to them as children, and that they still agree with most of them. Here is my point. The laws in place right now in this country do not allow in any way, shape, or form the behavior of the people in the biblical example cited earlier. That type of behavior is not permitted regardless of what sex or gender anyone identifies with most. So when comparing our homosexuals to the homosexuals in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, possibly for the first time in the history of the world, there exists a moral, ethical, law-abiding, religion-respecting, and highly educated body of homosexuals that are good people, even noble people. Most are people of remarkable integrity. That is part of why they don't hide their orientation in regards to their sexual preference. It would be a breach of integrity to not vocalize what they really stand for. Knowing that they are different than the majority, I imagine homosexuals probably raise their children with a stronger commitment to observation, in the sense that they observe to see what their child discovers about him or herself, believing from their own experience that the child will naturally be attracted to a sex, and that the child is probably astute enough to be thinking about that question from a young age. Am I like my parents? Am I gay? Or do I like boys? And asking that question, am I attracted to men or women? The parents simply observe from a non-judgmental perspective and allow their child to discover or to choose and love him or her regardless of the choice he or she makes. So long as the kid turns out to be a good person, that sounds like a good way for any parents to do it. A comparable thought I have had, I think, is that because certain mannerisms have been marked as those common to homosexuals, it is entirely possible that from a very early age that young men are labeled as gay when in truth their mannerisms are simply effeminate. However, because most males who have overly girly or effeminate mannerisms are commonly gay, even if no same-gender attractions are present the first times a male hears himself being called gay, then over time that child accepts that label, lives into it, and through environmental conditioning chooses to be gay even when the same-sex attractions were not originally there. But once this young man has finally accepted the label once and for all, he's in it for the long haul, no matter what it takes, no matter what's involved. Come hell or high water, he is going to be gay, and he is going to rock at it. At that point, it is also an identity thing, and at that point, how can you even think of taking that away from someone? That effeminate boys may be conditioned to be gay when they otherwise have no previous disposition to same-sex attractions makes me sad, but probably just as sad as a gay person who recognizes same-gender attraction in a child and sees the parent of that child making it clear to the child that that kind of behavior is not okay here, and through disapproval, they stare it down till behaviorally it is beaten out of the child. Maybe it will be beaten out forever, but maybe not. I suppose that's what closets are for. Only time will tell. Section 17. Gay men marrying women. I read a story of a gay man, also a Mormon, who weighed having a relationship with another man with whom a physical attraction prevailed, or marrying a woman and having the opportunity to share in procreation and have his own biological children. For him, the emotions and experience surrounding having a traditional family were more important to him than being attracted to his partner. With that thought in mind, there are women that are more attractive to me than my wife, and there are men out there who are more attractive to my wife than I am to her. So even though there are others out there who are more physically attractive to us, we still choose to stay together. While I agree that it is crucial that a level of physical attraction is present in a relationship, it is such a small part of all the other aspects of a relationship that have to jive in order for a relationship to work in the long term. A gay man marrying a woman he is less attracted to, in my mind, is very similar to a man marrying a woman who is less attractive to him than other women. Point. Homosexuality is offensive and invasive to the American majority to change the definition of marriage. It is taking the most valuable aspect of people's lives and changing it. No matter what the change is, because it is a change, it is seen as a threat to what they have. Feeling any type of alteration translates as taking away the importance of marriage, because it is diluting the definition, and anything that is diluted is not as potent as something that is 100% pure. Mormons opposed Prop 8 because of the manner in which the law would be implemented. Many Mormons sympathized that gays should have some type of right to union. However, none of them agreed that any religious institution would not have the right to agree or disagree with homosexual unions, and none agreed with the fact that by law, any Mormon pastor would be forced to marry a gay couple who asked to be wedded by him. Not having a choice is what was unethical about Prop 8 for Mormons. It would have taken away a religious freedom. We no longer would have had a choice in the matter. We would be forced by law to comply to the will of the homosexual community in America. To Mormons, that same type of political rape is a type of behavior familiar to the gays of Sodom and Gomorrah. When it comes to imposing one's will on someone else, the loss of freedom and not having choice is eerily similar. What did I say before? If it can happen once, it can happen again. The context is different, but the end game is the same. It is a versus match of freedom, and again, it is a civil rights versus religious freedom. If the story of Sodom and Gomorrah were true, that would mean that it is most likely that in that era, or in that city at least, there was no religious freedom, and so at that time, civil rights won. Because of the precious nature of sealings in the Mormon Church, I will not go into them in detail, but I will explain what the basic belief is. Basically, the Mormon Church believes that it has the authority from God to bind marriages for all of eternity, not just till death do you part. The sealing power really isn't understood at all in the Mormon Church, and most leaders are open about that. The main consensus is that we don't know how it all works, but Jesus will figure out all the bugs in the end because he's cool like that. Here is where it gets tricky though. Imagine two high school sweethearts fall in love and get sealed, and then the man dies. What do we do now? So the widow is alone for a long time and falls in love again and gets married again, but ends up wanting to get sealed to him too. Then she dies and he remarries again and wants to get sealed to her. Can you imagine what this thing would look like with Henry VIII? No matter how complicated all these remarriages get, ultimately the Mormon Church just seals them all to each other and says, "Good luck, Jesus, you sort it out on your end." Not a perfect system really for a church that brags having a perfect gospel. But what church does have a perfect system? As far as I know, most gays could care less if they were ever allowed to get married in a Mormon temple, even though they do look really, really cool. I think that most of America knows that Mormons act kind of indifferent to their church buildings, but when it comes to their temples, there is something really special there. I think other people take note of it, but they don't talk about it much. The vibe I have caught my whole life is that people don't understand it at all, but they respect how much it means to us. We do our best to allow other religions that same space. With that said, here is a suggestion. If two same-sex individuals are living the standards of the Mormon Church and are fully committed to each other just as any traditionally married man and woman, why not also allow Jesus to work out all the bugs in the end also? Stop and think about that for a second. It is either really hard or really easy to get inside of a Mormon temple. If you want it to be really easy, all you have to do is lie a lot. If you want to go in fair and square, you have to basically be a saint plus or minus a few degrees of a doubting Thomas. It is a good thing that the standard is so high. It is a beautiful thing that should never be compromised. However, with how little we understand the movements of the universe, I think that there is space inside of Mormon doctrine without changing any lines on gender at all to accommodate homosexuals who wish to be Mormon. It may not be a gender thing, it may be a spirit or an intelligence thing, and if that is the case, then the body they have is exactly the body they should have, and though they may be different than everyone else because they are, that is the way it is intended to be, and they are also sons and daughters of God, and also should have access to the blessings of an eternal family if they want one, and Jesus will work out all the bugs in the end. That's basically the hope of Christianity anyway, right? If you are gay and you don't want to be Mormon, that's fine. Don't. If you are not gay and you don't want to be Mormon, that's fine. Don't. For those who do want to be Mormon and they want their children to have access to the teachings and principles of the church, it should be allowed regardless of whether they are gay or not. Do you have enough faith in Jesus to work out the bugs? Do you think he could handle that? If he really is the creator and the father of this world, then what are we doing wrestling with this one? Why not just hand it off to him and say, hey, we have been trying to figure this out for the last 4,000 years, and we are still sucking it up. So we are going to leave this one up to you. If gay couples are living the law of chastity as members of the Mormon Church, then there is really no space for deterioration. Marriage to the Mormon Church means chastity, fidelity, loyalty, and faithfulness to one person, period. Straight people can do it. Gays are normal people also, so they obviously have the inner strength to do the same, and they have been wanting to prove it for years. Section 18, the 007 factor. Looking beyond equal rights, what other reasons would same-sex couples want access to marriage? Will marriage raise the standard of integrity so that couples in same-gender relationships last longer? Is that the intent why homosexuals are pushing that issue so hard? Or is it an acceptance thing? Speaking personally, even if every country legalized gay marriage, I wouldn't look at gay marriages the same I look at heterosexual marriages, because to me they are evidently different. I would still admire them and respect them, but I don't know if I would ever see gay marriage through the same lens that I see heterosexual marriage through. If the hope is that legalizing gay marriage will cause the entire country to suddenly accept homosexuality, I don't think it will work. Why? I think that on a fundamental level, the majority of people have a gut feeling that homosexuality is wrong for them. Said in another way, I think that a nearness to homosexuality is unsettling for many people. I have an example provided by Hollywood. In the James Bond film Skyfall, the antagonist makes a homosexual advance on James Bond, where he places a hand on Bond's inner thigh and caresses his leg. At that moment in the film, I imagined someone doing that to me, which was a very uncomfortable moment. It was a homophobic moment for me. I think that moment in that film also made the antagonist easier to dislike. Hollywood preyed on the fact that most people have an unsettled or abrasive reaction to homosexuality, which is a strategic double standard. As much as Hollywood promotes rights for homosexuals, from the example I just shared, it is apparent that even Hollywood understands that most people feel uncomfortable with homosexuality and they take advantage of that fact in film when it serves them best. In the book The 5,000-Year Leap, which is a book on politics, the author briefly summarizes the behavior of minorities in the United States. On page 106, it reads, "Minorities in any country consider themselves outsiders who want to become insiders. As long as they are treated as outsiders, they do not feel equal. In some countries, outsiders are still treated with hostility for 300 or 400 years. In the United States, immigrants or outsiders can become insiders much more rapidly. Nevertheless, the transition is painful. Being a minority, even in the United States, is painful because acceptance depends on crossing the culture gap. This means learning the English language with an American dialect, more or less, attaining the general norm of education, which in America is fairly high, becoming economically independent, which often means getting out of the ghetto, and becoming recognized as a social asset to the community, which always takes time. Usually it requires far more time than the minority group can patiently endure. But the impatience of a minority can be an advantage. It expedites their assimilation by motivating greater effort to gain acceptance. In the United States, as a result, many members of a minority group are assimilated in a single generation, and a few are still struggling in the third. But these are the exceptions. They can't quite get across the culture gap. It is a fact of life in America, as everywhere else, that no ethnic group is going to be entirely comfortable or treated completely as equals in an adopted society until they have crossed the culture gap. For most minorities, the culture gap is learning to speak English. So what is the culture gap that the homosexual community has to cross? I don't think it is religion. I think it is a much more elusive and difficult concept that resides deeper inside of heterosexuals that is most likely related to innate programming that has been developing as a result of evolution for millennia. So what do I think the culture gap is that homosexuals have to cross? I think it is the feeling that most people had, like I did, when watching that scene in Skyfall. I think that when most men consider having another man's penis shoved in their asses, they have the same reaction as walking into spiderwebs in the dark. I wish there was a sophisticated way to say that, but there's not. That innate response wasn't taught by parents or society. It goes much further back than that, which will also make it a response that is difficult to erase or replace. Biologically, the human body is designed to reproduce, which came about as a result of millions of years of evolution. Social conditioning and media aren't going to change what people innately feel as a result of that much nature-backed momentum. As a quick tangent, returning to a previous thought, it may be possible that homosexual tendencies are a result of spiritual programming, which would operate independently of evolution or as its guide. Evolution by necessity programs life for reproduction, and as homosexuals are not programmed for reproduction, they are evolutionary anomalies. Also, I think Skousen, the author of The 5,000-Year Leap, made a good point when he stated that earning acceptance depends on becoming recognized as a social asset to the community. I think that long-term acceptance of same-sex marriage by the majority of the people living in the United States will depend on the homosexual community proving that they will use the right of marriage to contribute more so that they can be recognized as a social asset to the community. If they use the right of same-sex marriage to somehow contribute to the deterioration of society, it isn't going to go over well long-term. The majority may allow homosexuals to retain the right of same-sex marriage, but that doesn't mean that they will ever accept them. They may always be a minority that is considered an outsider. Section 19. 2 points. Point 1. Our brains and hearts are like radio beacons, and we can transmit and receive emotions from others and perceive them and be affected by them consciously and subconsciously. So if that is true, and I believe it is, then if a homosexual person were to silently or non-verbally ask for acceptance from others emotionally or ask, "Do you agree with homosexuality?" then as homosexuals are the minority, the majority are not homosexual, and their subconscious answers would most likely not be filtered by political correctness, meaning that no matter where homosexuals go, their subconscious would be barraged constantly by the rejection of emotions sent as answers from the subconscious of the majority to the questioning hearts of the homosexual minority. As our bodies are physiologically designed to operate this way, no law legalizing same-sex marriage will stop people from thinking and speaking honestly to themselves in their nonverbal internal dialogue. So the question then is, will passing laws condition society to accept homosexuality, and will conditioning outweigh the biological programming of millennia as a result of evolution that causes a repugnant reaction, homophobia, in most heterosexuals? Social conditioning may just be powerful enough to erase millions of years of innate biological programming. It just might. But should it? Point 2. To preface this next statement, I want to share how I personally relate to sex in order to provide a context for my next point. I am an artist, and I have worked hard to have a high quality in my craft, and my sex drive is high. In terms of my creativity, the need for sex is the biggest distraction of my life, and a damned nuisance. As sexual tension builds, much like Chinese torture, it becomes really difficult to focus on whatever project I am working on, and having sex isn't a matter of romance or enjoyment for the most part. It is a matter of having a sexual release as quickly as possible to release the sexual tension so I can get back to work as soon as possible. It is about having mental clarity, undistracted from sexual desires. So if I were just a little more vain or true to myself, depending on which side you were looking at, had I chosen to embrace my talent and give in to its seduction rather than starting a family, I can totally see how I could have eventually chosen to have a homosexual relationship. For me, it would have had nothing to do with attraction, romance, or sexual orientation or gender. It would have been a matter of practicality. Men and women relate to sex and relationships differently. Sex for women is driven by emotional needs, while sex for men is driven by physical needs. Not having to take time to bridge the gap between those differences would be really nice. Having a same-sex partner would instantly grant access to a partner that relates to sex in the same way, which would save a lot of emotional energy explaining ever-changing sexual needs. When dealing with a partner of the same sex, they would totally already understand it. Just thinking logically, having a same-sex partner could be exceptionally practical. Section 20. Fall Summit number 1. Mormons as a group aren't interested in doing what is popular or in democratic method. What I mean by that is that if a group of people vote on something and there is a majority or common consensus that one particular conclusion or solution is the right or best answer, what people vote on is irrelevant compared to God's will. Mormons depend on their leaders, and that their leaders possess the ability to commune intimately with the divine in such a way that they can decipher his will. Even if something makes no sense at all, if it comes from the church leaders, then it is God's will, and it doesn't matter if it is logical or sensible, the body of the Mormon church will follow it. Polygamy is a perfect example to illustrate this point. As far as I am aware, no Mormons who are called to live polygamy were excited about it. Leaders in the Mormon church go to great lengths to assure the members of the church that their decisions are not influenced by any societal pressures and that any of their counsel comes directly from God. That assertion weakens after analyzing empirical facts in the history of the church. I have 2 ugly examples that demonstrate my argument. One is when the church reversed its stand on plural marriage, after a great deal of political opposition, I might add. The second is when the church changed its stance to allow any worthy man to hold the priesthood. Before this time, men of certain races were not allowed to hold the priesthood. What is interesting or disappointing is that this decision came directly after the biggest push of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, then it stands to reason that his commandments would reflect his character. So it isn't so much that God changed his mind as it was that his servants weren't listening, because they were too racist to hear what God was saying. To be fair, let me offer a rebuttal to that last sentence. That isn't even mine. Fast forward to 2018 a moment. My wife has gone to the other side of our apartment to put the kids to bed, and a new friend and I are setting rocking chairs in the living room and start a discussion on racism that goes deep into the night. I discuss the stance of the early church of not allowing men of color to hold the priesthood with this friend, who is an African American man from Alabama, who had endured a deep culture of racism. Though he had never joined the church, this man had also studied the doctrines of the church at great length, and I asked him why he thought that leaders didn't allow blacks to hold the priesthood. His answer surprised me. He said, "You don't understand racism. The root of racism is hatred. You don't have any hatred in your heart, so you can't understand." Had early leaders of the church allowed blacks to hold the priesthood, the Mormon church wouldn't have survived. Church leaders allowed blacks to hold the priesthood as soon as it could be done, and the church still survive. There are pockets of culture that exist as time capsules, where things haven't changed much, and people from those places can provide insight into the past that is impossible to achieve when limited to judgments cast with a modern bias. Perhaps then it is unfair to judge the decisions of the past against the values of the present. His was a perspective I never would have imagined on my own. All right, jump back in time to where we were before. One of the most repeated promises in Scripture, said in different ways, is, "Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you." That promise is one of the most emphasized of teachings in the entire Mormon Church. So I suppose it is possible that regarding any single thing, we can ask God what is right or wrong, and that the leaders of the Mormon Church never asked God if they should give the priesthood to men of color, because it never mattered enough to them to ask it. It mattered to the men and the families of the men who were denied the priesthood, but being on the white side of the fence, church leaders weren't affected by not allowing those on the other side of the fence to have the priesthood, and left it alone as long as they could. Only after the civil rights movement, when remarkable men and women of courage and intellect expounded excellent arguments surrounding goodness and morality, did the Mormon Church change its policy and allow any worthy man to hold the priesthood. So a possible reason Mormon church leaders did not allow all worthy men to hold the priesthood is because they had never asked if they should. It took an outside force to introduce ideas that were able to work on the hearts of church leaders, where they were concerned enough and invested in the issue to truly investigate and consider whether or not it was God's will that they change the church's policy. I reserve the possibility that religious leaders can be instructed by divinity to guide religious followers to live in such a way that they have a higher probability of having access to happiness and fulfillment. Under this assumption, it is possible that the leaders of the Mormon Church can still receive direction that affects the welfare of the whole Mormon Church. So while leaders of the Mormon Church may be able to listen to the counsel of God, I feel it irrefutable to admit that the decisions of church leaders have also been influenced by society or forces in society. With that said, if individuals of courage can present ideas and concepts to change the hearts of religious leaders to the point that they are more receptive to listening and hearing the will of God, then all of us, everyone, has a responsibility to say something, to contribute to the conversation, to assist that influence of thought. Leaders of the Mormon Church have not ignored the issue of homosexuality, but the rest of the world will never know how long or intense their discussions have been. As a result, it feels as if they are ignoring homosexuality the same way that they ignored the issue of any worthy men having access to holding the priesthood. They didn't even inspect the issue or whether or not all men should have access to the priesthood till others made them care. Leaders of the Mormon Church are men of the highest moral caliber, and following God's will is vitally important to them, and they are hyper-conscious that doing what the rest of society concludes as the right thing to do may not be the same thing. As men of remarkable intelligence, they are invested in carefully weighing every factor in their decision-making. Revelation in the Mormon Church is a marriage between intellect and prayer. If politicians took as much care in their policy-making as the leaders of the church, there would be far fewer problems in the world. What I wish is that leaders of the Mormon Church would be more open about how much their decisions are based on intellect, reason, and logic, and admit the obvious fact that they are men first, and though they are men of God, Because they are men, they are fallible, they make mistakes. The Mormon Church does not apologize for mistakes. I wish that it would. They do not apologize for mistakes because it would damage the faith that members of the church have in their leaders and the relationship that church leaders claim to have with God. Not apologizing for mistakes is a political move inside the Mormon Church for this reason, in order to retain devoted members who follow at all costs. The policies made by the Mormon Church are influenced by societal pressures. Leaders of the Mormon Church don't care about homosexuality enough to change their policies. Individuals of courage will have to introduce clear arguments of goodness and morality in relation to homosexuality and a new wave of civil rights actively to have a chance at changing their minds. It never will be just a matter of being able to convince them. It will be determined by Mormon church leaders praying about the ideas and concepts introduced to them and having a unanimous agreement between all 15 leaders. Whether supporting an issue will make Mormons popular or unpopular will not affect the fortitude of Mormons in remaining committed to the direction of their leaders. Mormons don't care what is popular. They have never been popular. They care what God's will is, and they will follow God's will as defined by their leaders, even if it doesn't make sense to them. Like in fundamental doctrines in the church, a war of ideas introduced through tact and persuasion will be what sways hearts one way or another. No other approach will have any level of effectiveness. So proposing relevant, logical, and moral-based arguments in an attitude of peace will be the only way to have any particle of a chance in changing the Mormon Church's stance on homosexuality. Section 21, Black and White. I thought this section would be my conclusion, but as I have delved into this topic, I feel very much like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. There was far more to all of this than I originally thought. I have had a couple realizations. For those listening to this, these realizations will most likely sound comical, as they have been obvious to you from the start. My attempts to make sense of homosexuality come from a deeply seated culture of superstition and religion, which may make them useless in coming to any conclusions. I think that people who are raised in religious households have been conditioned to think in terms of black and white. I think that educated and liberal people who are not raised in religious households do not possess this deep-rooted need to see things in black and white. As most of our country and most of our world is built on religion, and seeing things through a lens of religion is the very ship that we as a culture are sailing in, I cannot help but feel concern, great concern even, at the possibility of compromising our ship. In what may come to be seen as an effort to appease paganism and secular ideals, society may not have something concrete to stand on and to hold it together. If the ship dissolves, then all people will fall and have to swim independently in a depthless ocean of ideas, possibility, and discovery. Some may say, "Great, that is the way it should be." While I concede that there are good things available in that scenario, there are also just as many dangers. The dangers included in these depths, free of the protection of our ship, are isolation, doubt, and all the negative emotions and consequences from experimenting on an individual basis and making the wrong choices. Natural law does not allow many mistakes in a row before survival, actual life, and death situations are brought to bear. Compromising the ship that serves the majority in an effort to make a minority satisfied is truly dangerous. Generally, people are innately good. But if the ship that holds society together is discarded, what the society of the future will look like is a question mark, and that is frightening. I want to do the best I can to give a better world to my children and those who will live after me. At the least, I don't want to give them something worse or something that will become worse. I want a guarantee that things will not be worse. And in order for me to have that guarantee, my logical conclusion is that in order for that to happen, some things cannot change. Because of fear, because of my fears of being responsible for taking part in deteriorating society, I also want to see things in black and white. I want clear, obvious evidence of what is right and what is wrong. From other things I have written in this essay already, I am not sure if that is possible in relation to how I have framed some concepts. I have always felt that there is this large majority of people who are generally the same sexually, and then there is this small minority that is different, and it has always been this way. One possibility that I suggested is that people with same-sex attractions are individuals of a more rare variety, and their physical bodies are following a spiritual blueprint that have these same characteristics spiritually. It is my belief that gender is an eternal characteristic, which does not contradict the possibility and the truth that regardless of gender, same-sex attractions can still exist in some. What is blowing my mind now is the concept that a large percentage of all humans experience same-sex or bisexual attraction. If that is true, then my theory of the blueprint might go poof, with up to a quarter of all humans, male and female, both struggling with identifying which sex they are attracted to at any given time, leads me to believe that it all may be fair game. There may not be any kind of blueprint reading going on at all. And with that thought in mind, there goes black and white. It's all up in the air now. Section 22. How about you fall down the rabbit hole with me? Ready? Here we go. The Mormon Church has done good things for white, straight men. As soon as you expand beyond that, generally speaking, it begins to break down. One argument that Mormons use to rationalize the bad that has occurred inside the LDS Church is that while men are called of God, sometimes the man gets in the way of the calling. Right? So that is easy for someone like me to say, who is a white, straight man, who has had relatively few grievances with the LDS Church. But when you look to those outside of that narrow demographic, albeit large, then you see the collateral damage. Gays are the collateral damage. They are the ones who are impaled with such strong feelings of guilt that they are driven to suicide or extraordinary extremes to rid themselves of the same-sex attractions they have. That argument that sometimes the man gets in the way of the calling falls apart in the face of a real person who has suffered deep emotional trauma and multiple suicide attempts. The Mormon Church had the stance of homosexuality is wrong, but has altered that to you can be homosexual, you just can't act on it. If the roles were reversed somehow, and it was mainstream to be homosexual, and I was told you can be heterosexual, you just can't act on it, that would be when I opted out, mostly because it is absurd to me to deny the biological drive to reproduce. I don't think I could do it, and what's more, I wouldn't want to. Homosexuals, most of them at least, were raised in religious households because most of the world and most of the people in the world are religious. As far as those I know personally, they were all burned by their religion and opted out. So in that way, the homosexual community are social outcasts. Those mentally strong enough to have survived suicide, as well as severing whatever they must in order to be free of the negative and judgmental perceptions of their family and culture they were raised with, are the ones that commit to discover what will bring them fulfillment and joy in this life, without having to tiptoe around the rigid rules of what fits inside the definition of moral in terms of behavior. What that means in literal terms is that the homosexual community experiment with sex liberally in order to discover what works best, and not surprisingly, it comes down to an individual by individual basis. Homosexuals that have the mental and emotional fortitude to leave their past and everything that previously defined them behind, to stand with powerful social independence, have a very keen understanding of sex, communication, and relationships because they have worked diligently to find the answers to these questions outside of the restrictions of monogamy, religion, social perceptions, or anything else that holds people back from trying something that is otherwise mostly shunned. They were hurt so bad by the system that they have no obligations and no loyalty to the rest of society when it comes to sexual activity. I have a friend who stated with pride that he had shared sex with over 200 people, and that he never was in a committed relationship. All of them were open, and that he liked it that way, enjoyed them being that way, but acknowledged that it might not always be that way. So in his opinion, he saw it as absurd that anyone would only have sex with one person and stay committed to one person for an entire lifetime. Though it isn't enjoyable for me to think about, there's probably a man out in the world that I may enjoy having sex with, and on the same note, there may be a woman out there that my wife would enjoy having sex with. He stated that it isn't what you do, it's why you do it. I can see politicians that have a lot of power making terrible sacrifices for the greater good if they believe and operate under this mantra. However, when explained in terms of sex and relationships, I can respect it. My friend said in effect, "Why are you faithful to your wife? Is it because your religion or culture tells you to be that way? Or is it because you love her and you want to be with her? You see the difference? Are you loyal and faithful because you really don't want to be, but fake it because you are afraid of the perceptions of people you respect and care about, and what they will think about you and how society will treat you? Or are you faithful because you love your wife and want to be with her?" Some people are probably in marriages that are unhealthy and suck for a lot of reasons, but stay in them based on social expectations or communicated agreements. In a conversation, a friend confided that he was in an open relationship with 3 men, and that it was one of the most fulfilling and rewarding and healthy relationships he has ever had. And it seemed that it was especially so in terms of emotional health. He explained that the main reason that it was that way is because of the level of communication that they all shared. They had a formal agreement, much like a contract, that they discussed in great detail that created rules for what each one of them was comfortable and uncomfortable with sexually. All of them shared, all of them listened, all of them felt heard, and all of them followed and operated under the agreement or contract with perfect fidelity, which no doubt made all of them feel respected, because of their wishes were honored, which would likely make them feel loved as well. Contrasting that process of communication to the mainstream of religious heterosexuality, sex is not discussed openly enough in most households for youth to grow into adults who have the capacity to have mature conversations about sex. Learning how to be an effective communicator is a difficult skill not taught in most households, and from my experience, the only ones who develop it do so independently because they recognize the need to develop it, and it is important to them to rock at it.
So what I foresee coming, with much more clarity than ever before, are 2 very opposite approaches to establishing a society. One approach is the one we have now, in which religion is the key component. The second approach is one that is driven by following or being true to our biology in terms of appetites, and that the only way to successfully do so is through excellent communication. So the greatest civil war of behavior and lifestyle is coming our way and is about to land. It has been percolating into the mainstream of society slowly, and all of its progress has been heavily opposed by religion every step of the way, but it has been progressively taking more hold and grown roots. It hasn't gone away and only becomes more predominant. My stance is that this method of contractual sexuality works well for a sophisticated, highly intelligent breed of human, but would be an absolute mess if applied to the masses. Far worse a mess than religion has made, and now I will expound my argument as to why. Picture this. Imagine a society in which you are married to your wife, and after several years, you are bored sexually, and so you invite another sexual partner to share intimacy with you and your wife, and it goes great, and you do it more and more. Though you are married, you do it till you have a very open relationship, and it is known, and from the viewpoint in society, it is acceptable and common. Many will have hundreds of sexual partners that they will share sex with occasionally. Some will be married and have open relationships, and some will find after experimenting that a monogamous relationship is best for them. So what is coming is a far broader spectrum of what is socially acceptable. But it will be a spectrum. If there is a dial, like on a speedometer, homosexuals and heterosexuals alike will follow along every notch from 0 to 100. In contrasting the traditional religious route to this new approach of honest biology, the first thing that comes to mind for me is my baby boy. In an ideal home, the religious approach is safe for the development of children, whereas I think that children would have to be shielded from the activities of their parents in the new approach, because it would be remarkably confusing and traumatic for them. From what I have observed in my own son, there is something innate in him that expects and wants my wife and I to be together and to be with him as much as possible. He needs both of us desperately. Another question I have is, where does that come from? The immediate answer for me, as a superstitious theist, is that there is a spiritual nature to humans, and that innocence, understanding, and expectation of a family structure come with the child. Whenever I am away on business trips or my wife is on vacation without me, my son has a really difficult time. So if this new approach is the correct one, why would we need to shield our children from it? If it could confuse them in every category of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual areas of their lives, how could it be the right thing to do? The real question becomes, would that even happen to children if raised in that environment? Initially, I see too much danger for adults to abuse this new system more than they abuse the current system of marriage. It seems obvious to me that these two very different approaches to living life will resonate with different people and will work for some, whereas they will not work for others, which is why people will fall along every range of the spectrum. I also have another concern about the honest biology approach. If I could write a book called How to Avoid Murder for Dummies, all it would need to say is, don't cheat on your partner. So while in theory, the honest biology approach may work for a lot of homosexuals, I think that physically, human beings are wired to have sex with multiple partners, but spiritually, they are not. So falling back on my religious upbringing again, I have to concede that there is a carnal side of man that is drawn to lust, and there is a spiritual side of man that is drawn to goodness. I feel those two poles pulling at me in my own life. In addition, humans suck at sharing resources of all kinds and always have. I think that if all of the entire population attempted to live by this approach, that there would be a massive breakdown in the attempt, and based on jealousy, selfishness, and other negative emotions, people would breach their agreements and contracts of what is and isn't acceptable in their sexual relationships, and the instability that would occur in society as a result would be greater than the instability we now experience in a society based on religion. No matter how mature and sophisticated we think we are, when placed in situations in which all of the most negative human passions are tried, will we be able to remain committed to our contracts and agreements? How dependable is the integrity of men and women as a whole? But you know what? We won't really know till we try it out, right? And we will. It is already happening. The difficulty will be that all religions discourage infidelity and are structured for the most part around monogamy. As the full sexual fluidity or honest biology approach becomes more common in society, there will be a need for a greater level of tolerance from both sides in order for society to survive at all. Commitment to one approach versus the other will likely become a wedge that drives society apart. Both approaches have every reason to feel threatened by the other. As it stands, they are not compatible. It will be interesting to see what happens with first world countries on Earth over the next few hundred years. Historically speaking, only a thriving civilization has the luxury of experimenting with sexuality. With a focus on that experiment, societies become soft and are easily overtaken by other lesser developed nations that have not compromised the strengths of the sexes to the exploration of sexuality. Cognitive dissonance is something that human beings avoid whenever possible. If you see a cat bark like a dog, that is cognitive dissonance. Anytime that you see something that doesn't fit, it is mentally uncomfortable. Humans dislike cognitive dissonance, and they refrain from doing it themselves as a result. It can easily be argued that homosexuality is a form of cognitive dissonance for heterosexuals, as something out of the ordinary is taking place and it makes them feel unsettled. An argument that is made by atheists is that all people in all religions are experiencing cognitive dissonance but don't even realize it or they ignore it. And by definition, if anyone does that, then they are a sociopath. So to atheists, anyone religious is crazy, literally, and they don't see how so many people can know they are doing the wrong thing and still do it. It is like a conflict in integrity. You know what is right, and you know what qualifies as operating inside or outside of integrity, and you know and still operate outside of it. That will create cognitive dissonance, and it feels terrible. I think I know how religious people are able to experience cognitive dissonance and not go crazy. Even though it is irrational, the world taught and understood by the religion feels very familiar and very good, and the one thing that is disrupting the peace, even if it is true, says that everything that feels familiar and good is wrong. So it is easy, super easy, to throw it out. It is outnumbered by all kinds of momentum. However, I personally feel that religions have been articulating the spiritual nature of man as clearly as possible for thousands of years. Amidst all of the shortcomings, I cannot deny my conviction in this spiritual side of all humankind. This spiritual side is so obvious to me that I feel that anyone who denies it is just as guilty as a person who experiences cognitive dissonance as a result of a belief in God. Science answers specific questions and does not even attempt to answer the types of questions that religion answers. Likewise, religion cannot provide the type of answers offered by science. Both provide different kinds of answers, and human beings need both. Section 23. Takeaways, but not the end. Under a contract of full sexual fluidity, there is full freedom to experiment sexually with anyone. Opposite of that on the spectrum is a marriage contract outlining complete fidelity to one person. I have some gay friends that want marriage, and I have others that have no interest in marriage. In considering what my gay friends would think, I feel that both of them would frown on people who make commitments of fidelity and commitment, then deliberately break them. I think the attitude for many gays is that sexuality is such a difficult thing to rein in. Why waste the time and energy trying to do so? Not only that, I am sure many feel from their personal experience that it is impossible to contain. So the only realistic approach is to toss concepts such as marriage to one side. I believe that practicing sexual temperance may be impossible for some homosexuals and even damaging to them. I am not sure this is true, but it seems that as a result, they think that the rest of society must also be that way and is simply lying about it. From personal experience and from incredible people I know and admire, I know that sexual temperance is possible. To that, it can be argued that even if it is possible, why entertain it when there is another alternative that, when approached correctly, will not damage society and is entirely pleasurable? What is the downside to a responsible approach to full sexual fluidity? Surely it cannot be as damaging to society as marriage has been? In conversations with my gay friends, I cannot help but sense the bitterness they feel for the struggles they have been forced to grapple with, which has not just been with sexuality, but with life itself. For gays, especially those from strong religious families, the struggle between sexuality and life is one and the same. Having been forced into that space by society, I can only imagine they feel the rest of society deserves to feel and see things through the same lens as them. I am not sure we can. If we can, should we? Is the danger of doing so too great? For those of us who are not in the sexual minority, what do we stand to lose? Another question I have asked recently is what primary traits drive humanity and thus society? Which of all the traits is in the driver's seat? Is sexuality the steering wheel of our humanity? Have we thought something else was in the driver's seat all the time sexuality was the trusted vizier controlling the sultan the whole time? Has it been in the driver's seat? And if not, then what is? Considering the adoption of full sexual fluidity begs the question, should we consciously allow sexuality to take the steering wheel for humanity? As elusive as sexuality has proven to be, taking a firm grasp of it sounds like an intelligent thing to do, and yet its flow and direction is as unpredictable as the course of a river over time. Human beings typically choose to rely on constraints that never change and use such constants to rule their societies and govern their lives. What would happen to us as a species if we pinned our future to something that is fluid and constantly changing? What happens if our moral compass has no true north? Fidelity, commitment, loyalty, temperance are traits we need in all people in order for society to remain healthy. These are attributes that can survive and through nourishment thrive, regardless of whether marriages are between same-sex couples or heterosexual couples. Marriage is a standard of commitment in society. A desire for marriage indicates a willingness to develop the aforementioned attributes. Truly, perhaps many homosexuals recognize they need this standard of commitment, recognizing that relationships based on full sexual fluidity hold no interest for them, and they want something they can latch onto that carries with it the support and assured encouragement of society. Surely, if marriage were erased for heterosexuals, how lost would society be? What would that look like? There are still cultures where it is socially acceptable to have 30 or more sexual partners, making parenthood, families, disease, and death impossible to trace or control. Such culture blurs the lines of propriety. Societies in those countries are unhealthy and weak. Once such a state has become the culture of the people, it is difficult for a society to recover or alter its cultural habits. If culture is like an addiction, we should be careful in what we choose to become addicted to, as addictions themselves prove difficult to break. How dangerous, then, is it to consciously create a culture based on sexuality and become addicted to it? The word spirituality may simply be an articulation of language to describe a specific range of experience relative to the human condition, but I personally feel that spirituality is a compass of resonance where the eternal nature of our energies recognize truths in the void from whence we came. As a result of my experience with spirituality, I believe in the Holy Spirit and that it testifies of truth. And when we encounter truths in our own walks of life, those truths resonate with the truth inside of us. As a result of this commitment to a traditional superstitious viewpoint, I believe that there is both a physical and spiritual aspect to our beings. I believe that from an evolutionary standpoint, like many animals, humans are physically designed to have multiple sexual partners. However, spiritually, human beings are not designed to share sexually with more than one person. I once had a friend ask me what was my take on the stance of hate the sin, not the sinner, in relation to homosexuality. It is impossible for me to treat someone like they are normal if I feel they are sinning. On some level, I will treat them differently, and though subtle, they will distinguish the difference, and so will I. In order to successfully demoralize sex, it is necessary to disable the spiritual side of reasoning in our beings. Said in another way, in order for relationship contracts to succeed inside the bounds of full sexual fluidity, a person will have to rewrite him or herself in how he or she views his or her own spirituality. For some, because the struggle with sexuality is also a struggle with life itself as a survival tactic, a person will have to become spiritually dead in order to continue living. How do you feel about your close friends giving up their spirituality in order to survive? They will be different than before, but they will live. Because I see our spirituality as something as impossible to avoid and hide from as our sexuality, I think it massively foolish to presume that sexual contracts under full sexual fluidity will last or work at all for everyone, as most people will feel jealousy or similar negative emotions when they see someone they have shared an excellent sexual relationship with break off and have that relationship with someone else. Despite the fact that the agreement has to have an open relationship, because of the spiritual side of mankind, there will be a breakdown in those agreements. That is why full sexual fluidity is not for the masses, and that is why marriage is a better model for the masses than a model of full sexual fluidity or biological honesty. I openly admit that I am afraid of adopting full sexual fluidity because I do not think it would help me assert more self-control in my life. I feel that for me personally, it would too easily lead to a lifestyle whereby I could lose myself and not have the ability to gain back what I lose. I think that many people, both heterosexual and homosexual alike, can employ a commitment to full sexual fluidity and thrive with it. However, I feel that it is a course that is not in the best interest of the masses. Truly, full sexual fluidity is only for an elite type of person, the type of person that can keep it in check. I am not sure if I am that type of person, and I am not willing to experiment out of fear of what I might lose. Near the end of her lecture, Lisa Diamond explained how the leadership of the Mormon Church approached her and asked her for any research and material that they could study to help them make a more informed opinion regarding homosexuality. She told them no, that she had nothing to give them, because even with all of the data that has been gathered and all of the experiments being done on bisexuality and homosexuality, there are no conclusions. The data is so varied that there is no common conclusion. After reflecting on that for a while, it occurred to me, of course, how could there be? How do you measure matters of the heart? That is why it is a spectrum. It comes down to an individual by individual basis. It seems there is no consensus between scientists either, who have studied topics of sexuality for their entire careers. Dr. Paul R. McHugh has a view on transgenderism that is both bold and unpopular, so much so that over time his opinion may simply be drowned by the sheer volume of others providing research and evidence that supports and reinforces the agenda of the sexual minority. After all of the reading, writing, and thinking I have done as a result of this exploratory essay over the past 10 years, I have to admit that I feel ridiculous. I have wanted to make sense of homosexuality so badly that I have made a fool of myself. If foolishness is the price for knowledge and the new perspectives it provides, what an excellent price to pay. I must acknowledge that the only logical conclusion to come to as a result of my study of homosexuality is that there is no God. My reasoning for that conclusion is that a loving God would not make a plan that deliberately excludes a large portion of his children from ever being able to return home to him. It makes no sense that an all-knowing God would make a broken plan. And if the plan is broken, it must be because it isn't God's plan at all, but ideas conceived by man to make life more bearable, and the concept of God must also be the product of a primitive, superstitious mind. However, from my unique walk in life, in which I have witnessed scientifically impossible things, I refuse to give up my illogical belief in God, which has forced me to take a closer look at this paradox of homosexuality and how it fits into God's plan of happiness, whereby all his children can return to him. So what are my conclusions? I am going to love my wife and 2 sons the best I can, be the best person I can be, and sit back and watch the world and see what happens. Section 24. 5 years later, February 7, 2021. I listened to a fireside by Matt Groh, the Director of Publications for the Church History Department for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My main takeaways are that I don't need to use the 1 or 2 or more things that I disagree with regarding things the church has done as a wedge and a reason to detach myself from the church. Instead, when certain things are said in the church that I disagree with, I need to say, I disagree with that. I don't believe that, and yet I am still a member of this church. I choose to be and want to be. There is a spirit in this church that I believe is divine. There are only a handful of things I don't believe or disagree with that I may never resolve. If leaders of my church are threatened by that and use my refusal to deny my own integrity as grounds for throwing me out of the church, then so be it. Most people who leave the church do so as a matter of integrity. There was something they could not resolve, and so by choice removed themselves from the church as they no longer felt in alignment with it, which makes them feel in turmoil, so they cannot feel at home in the church. They no longer feel they belong there. I've seen this happen to several of my friends. I will never be able to deny some things that I believe are true. I hope a church leader does not make it his agenda to eject me from the church because I do not currently or cannot currently agree with every policy or stance the church takes on every matter that is happening in the world or has happened. If the ego of such a leader demands he or she be right, and in order for that person to be right demands I deny my integrity, I will not do it. This is what I believe that I will not turn my back on, unless God teaches me somehow that I am wrong. I believe God is not responsible for our natures. I do not believe He made our natures. I believe He found us, our intelligences rather, and made us spirit bodies, which transformed us as beings without affecting our natures, and in performing this transformation of creating our spirit bodies, He claimed and branded us as His and became our Heavenly Father and us His spirit children. In that, our spirit bodies are to our intelligences what our spirits are to our physical bodies. I believe that our physical bodies read the fingerprint, as it were, the blueprint of our spiritual bodies, and the divine side or component in our biology reads it and follows it as closely as possible. As such, gender is eternal. Gender is the fruit of a law in the universe, the law of opposites. This law cannot be broken or changed. But gender is not binary. There is overlap in traits, and our intelligences carry that identity, that absolute uniqueness. Those traits were carried to our spirit bodies and are interpreted as accurately as millions of years of evolutionary biology can possibly interpret, and it is my belief that because of the love of God in crafting our vehicle of mortality, because of His love for us, the margin of error in the interpretation is extremely small. Notwithstanding, there are limitations to the physical side in being able to deliver what the blueprint commands to build, and such limitations are a result of God using evolutionary biology as a platform for progress. To say that God did not set up any rules for how the physical body reads the blueprint of the spiritual body is to say that God is not a loving God. I believe He is. It is my experience that He is a merciful God and a loving God also. With that belief, I can only conclude that He set tight rules for how the blueprints of our spirits are interpreted, the most principal being that He could not and would not impose on our freedom of choice, meaning that He would not overshadow anyone's true spiritual nature, but ensure that it be preserved intact as perfectly as biologically possible. From what I see in life, I am convinced that homosexuality is not a flaw in biology or a choice. For some it can be, but for many it is a matter of their divine nature. For some, they cannot deny their eternal nature, which somehow, when translated and interpreted into mortality, same-sex attraction is the result. Same-sex attraction and other such dispositions, which have all been assigned labels by our society to assist society to better understand them. I cannot believe that God would allow between 5 to 10% of His children to inherit bodies that were mistranslated. Instead, I choose to believe that those 5 to 10% chose to experience life on earth with an understanding that their souls are of a more rare variety that would face challenges as a result of their uniqueness, but because of an understanding in the rare opportunity of mortality to have a fuller method of experiencing the wonders of our universe, chose to come anyway. That makes them a brave variety by default. It was not God that made that choice. He gave them agency when he gave them spirit bodies, possibly something they did not have before as mere intelligences, and with it they chose to come. They chose to live. I believe that this is fundamentally true. What comes next is mere speculation. So while I believe in the priesthood and the sanctity of the family, I see no reason or obstruction within the love of God for the definition of family to expand as needed to include souls who may physically both be male, but spiritually contain just as much feminine nature as any born woman. From my observation, a same-sex couple has chosen to make their home a religious and God-fearing one. I've seen heterosexual couples do far worse in their marriage and parenting than some same-sex couples. I've also seen more same-sex couples turn to a dark side of intimacy and sexuality. I think that is a result of rebellion. If they did not have to express their sexuality in the shadows, they could begin such relations from a healthy space and a safe one. As time goes on and same-sex marriage is more common, my hope and belief is that it will be cleaner, pure even, as there are inherent challenges to procreation in such couples. To pursue families and the structure of a family unit cannot happen by accident and is only the result of tremendous intention. Such intention should not be shunned but applauded. The family unit is what gives structure to society and will continue to do so. As some family units may look different over time, the efforts of their members to rear wholesome children and adults need to be welcomed and included, not alienated and denied the full benefits of fellowship. Homosexuality does have a dark side and a dark past, but hopefully those who identify as such will hold each other accountable over time to seek after the pure side of relationships, which can only come through monogamous marriage. Because of the instincts in our biology, any other method gets murky real quick. I recognize now may not be the time to expand the definition of a family to same-sex couples, but I believe that someday the Lord can and will reveal how that is possible inside of the church. So long as a loving couple are living the standards of the gospel, whether same-sex or not, I see it as pure beauty that all worthy couples have access to the full benefits of the temple. So long as all is done in light, then it shouldn't make any difference. That is why I am all for same-sex marriage. These thoughts have weighed heavily on my mind for years now, and my conscience required me to write them down. Now they are down, I feel lighter. I feel more free, less tense. I can breathe easier. I need to do so, and I am glad I did. Now down on paper, I can say to myself, is that really how I feel? Do I really believe that? I suppose that is the benefit of writing, to unbury one's subconscious thoughts so the conscious mind can then rest with it and thus discover what to do with it. Section 25, April 10, 2021. The church is not currently set up to treat all spiritual types equally, but it may someday. I see it entirely possible that one day, possibly hundreds of years from now, an appendix will be added to the family proclamation that does not negate it but complements it, adding the verbiage that any worthy couples living the gospel have full access to all blessings in the church on earth and in mortality. For that to happen, it will have to be universally understood that such a clause does not negate a single sentence in the proclamation, but that both are true. That marriage between a man and woman is ordained of God. That is true, and will always be true. But I believe that someday it will be declared that within the light of Christ and his purity, marriage and all it stands for between any two people who love each other is also ordained of God. The world isn't ready for that yet, even if it's already true. Jesus Christ is perfect, but his work, which is done by all of us imperfect humans, scramble around like ants for thousands of years at a time before we start to do something right. Hopefully, we can skip a few millennia this time around. Time will tell. Section 26, 2 years later. It is May 5th, 2023. A logical argument supporting my theory that God has not tampered with our divine natures has been lying in plain sight all this time, but has only just occurred to me. The most fundamental and core doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that of agency. The definition of agency inside of the Church extends beyond the simple definition of the ability to act. That is a large component of the purpose of having a physical body, but what is more is the freedom of choice. The ability to act and the freedom to choose for our own selves is the core doctrine of the Church. It is fundamental to God's plan and is the fundamental reason for the war in heaven as recorded in the New Testament in the book of Revelation. A war of ideas is still the most dangerous war now, as much as it was then. Within this sanctity of choice, which God has reserved for us and which He refuses to trespass upon, is the answer to the question, would God deliberately make His children so that some would experience homosexuality and the challenges that come with it? The answer is no. He wouldn't do that. He sends us down to prove us herewith to see whether we will choose good or evil. In this, the war that started in heaven continues, only now it is a war of influence, God's influence versus the law of resistance. I must believe, based on the assertion that God is the same today, yesterday, and forever, that if He honors our agency in mortality, that He also honored our agency from the inception of His plan for us. To me, that means that when He first discovered our intelligences and made us spirit bodies, that He respected His rules of holding agency sacrosanct. If He tampered with our divine natures at that moment, it would be the deepest violation possible. The only relative term would be something akin to spiritual rape. I must conclude that God honored our divine natures that were native to our intelligences. I believe that He was and is in awe of the uniqueness in each one of us. Speaking of a single intelligence, to try to improve it would only diminish it. To tamper with its nature would have distorted the outcome of the test of mortality. The conclusion is that if God honored our natures when creating our spirit bodies, that means that at the moment of our mother's bodies began reading our spiritual blueprint to fabricate our physical bodies in our mother's wombs, the physical body would have done its absolute best to read the blueprint of the spiritual body, which would have the same information recorded in its divine nature as when it existed merely as an intelligence. That means that if a person's sexual orientation were part of their original divine nature as an intelligence, then that divine nature would have been honored and respected and remained untouched and allowed to continue to this stage of existence of mortality on earth. So God does not make one person homosexual and another heterosexual. We were already one way or the other before He ever found us. Why would God make us all so different only to make us all the same in the end? The answer is, He didn't make us all so different. We were already different. In that case, why try to make us all the same? I don't think He tries to make us all the same either. I believe a purpose of this life, one of many objectives, is for all of us to learn the most important things that life can offer, and that after we have learned those things, we will have all the same main lessons in common, which will provide a level of unity among all of His children that would be impossible to achieve without this life of mortality on earth. If we are not one, we are not His. I believe a few of these main lessons include the following: the importance of the sanctity of life, a respect for purity, kindness, the ability to empathize, and whether it is resented or not, the opportunity to come to some kind of understanding of the consequences of our actions in this life. My hope for myself is to get to the end of my rope without any addictions, control of my passions, and as few regrets as possible. If I can head into the spirit world with that figured out, then I think everything else I was lacking won't be hell to figure out. And to the inverse, if I don't have those figured out, then the afterlife will be hell, to try to navigate those challenges without a physical body as a tool to do so. My reasoning for this is based on the scripture found in Alma chapter 34, verse 34. Why and how would looking at our divine origins from this perspective be helpful? Because if a person finds herself in a female body but has a fluid gender identity where she relates more to men, feeling she has more in common with a male-minded body than a female-minded body, this perspective can be helpful because they can trust that both their spirit and nature, to the best as was able, interpreted the blueprint as accurately as it could, and if that is the case, even if a person relates closely with men, the blueprint had to choose one or the other, and the closer of the two was a female body. Overall, this perspective can provide people with a self-acceptance that they may not have been able to tap into before. With the crossover of masculine and feminine traits present in all people, there is nothing wrong with feeling masculine in a female body or feeling feminine in a masculine body. More than anything, the war is over a state of mind. For the gender minority, interpretations and meaning provided by religion have failed, forcing them to seek help outside of religion. What does that look like? People are currently using hormone blockers coupled with counseling to achieve a desired state of mind. It is working for some, but the true numbers aren't in yet. So this is an alternative, a suggestion to look back towards a spiritual interpretation found from doctrines of a religion. Hopefully this one is more helpful at assisting young people to come to peace with who they are and win the state of mind they hope for. In my own effort to make sense of this life, I have felt compelled to explore these ideas, and in so doing, I will likely have offended members of my own church as well as the homosexual community, making myself an outcast from them both. Even so, I hope these ideas are helpful to some in making sense of this life, generating meaning, and coming to their own conclusions that will be empowering to them, and hopefully make the challenges of this life more bearable. Closing comments. 20 years ago, I was fortunate enough to be a state champion in a science fair competition. I was able to perform my own experiments 2 consecutive years, with 2 years prior of assisting upperclassmen with their science experiments and attending their competitions. From excellent mentorship, I was able to qualify in the top 3 at nearly every science fair I attended. At most of the science fairs, in addition to whatever my place was, I was frequently awarded Best Use of the Scientific Method, which I felt more proud to receive than winning first, second, or third place. From those years of studying how to perform proper science, I learned the importance of minimizing variables in order to isolate a specific variable to be tested. When I don't see the scientific method being properly followed, it is maddening for me. I can't explain how frustrating it is to me that it isn't being done right, and how obvious it is when it isn't being done right. Specifically toward the trans movement of sexuality, it appears that the most negligence has been and is currently being practiced when it comes to the employment of the scientific method. Whatever is measured can then be improved. What is remarkably frustrating is the resistance to measuring all aspects of data surrounding all cases of individuals who choose to transition their sex. In order to have a true and honest picture of what is in the best interest of society, this practice must change. To echo how I opened this essay, I believe the rainbow shouldn't be a symbol of the LGBTQ community, but rather a symbol for sexuality and an acknowledgement of its importance to individual identities and to society. The solutions of the past the majority has prescribed have not worked for the gender minority, and the solutions the trans minority is now proposing does not work for the majority, as both womanhood and manhood are under attack. As sexuality is something that gender minorities must face with greater urgency because they are part of us, they are interwoven in our lives as friends and family, we all must face sexuality and arrive at solutions together. Sparks will fly. But they did during the creation of the United States Constitution as well, and the conflict created by forcing opposing views into the same room for months on end proved worth it. I spoke earlier on the unity inside of the LGBTQ community. Each group represented by a letter has such different needs that there is no such thing as unity. There can't be, and yet by grouping them together, they are respected and feared as a group far more than they would be if they were isolated to individual groups represented by single letters. What is more is that individuals who identify under all of the other letters other than T hold the same sensible stance as a gender majority that great care should be taken when dealing with the sexuality of children. What the T's stand for is not necessarily what the L, G, B, and Q's stand for. The T group is leveraging the full power of the intersectionality of the LGBTQ title sequence, thus misrepresenting all of the other gender minority groups included in it, which I believe is wrong. Furthermore, over time, I doubt the other groups will stand for it if it continues, and in their own way secede from the union if it does. In taking the time to take a closer look at the topic of sexuality, it has been interesting to watch the conversation develop and see the T group and the LGBTQ gender minority assert ideas and gain momentum with their ideas. It seems to me that this experiment these minorities are testing is to try to prove that social ideas can nullify millions of years of evolutionary biological programming. If a person cannot deny her biology and that she experiences same-sex attraction, the effort of exercising her will to not be so is fruitless, despite the demands of a traditional religious society to deny those attractions. Biology wins out. The gender minority sentinels appear to be trying to use the same tactic as Christendom, only flipping the tactic on its head. While Christendom socially pressured homosexuals to not be so and feel guilt for failing, the gender minority sentinels are making the social idea claim that millions of years of biological development is insignificant simply by claiming so, thus overpowering biological evolution with a social idea, and makes the majority feel guilt if they claim otherwise. In that way, it is using guilt-motivated doctrine to control people, the same way Puritan religions utilized guilt-motivated doctrine to socially ostracize and shame those who didn't follow their authority. By using sophisticated language to elevate the argument to a level that the majority feels unqualified to address, it very effectively silences them from having a voice, which strips them of representation, making them feel both frustrated and powerless, and puts control over the majority in the hands of the gender minority, which, as I have explored, is not in the best interest of the majority. Also, it is hypocrisy. It is doing exactly what Christendom has done, using social pressure to deny a truth with the threat of shame for resisting the social pressure. It is just as self-righteous as religion in that it asserts it is justified, as its conquests are under the protective umbrella of the war for civil rights, and thus can have no faults. In its push for equality, it is stripping the freedoms of representation and freedom of speech from the majority, as well as other minority gender variant groups, and giving the power of those freedoms to their minority. A redistribution of rights is unacceptable, as it will only end with a loss in freedom for the majority. The gender minority should have equal rights only if they don't take the same rights they demand they have from the majority. If they do it, it will create a new aristocracy that has laws that apply to its members differently than to the masses. Aristocracies are not in the best interest of aristocracies, and that they are always minorities, and if they abuse their power too long, the majority removes them, and as a matter of sheer numbers, removes them easily, historically by destroying them. For that reason, the gender minority should not seek to elevate itself to a position of social aristocracy. In the long term, once the majority has lost its patience, all of the gains made by the gender minority may be compromised as they bring violence down on themselves as a result of ignoring the frustrated voices of the majority. The majority currently has a willingness to give equality to the gender minority and possesses a general acceptance of the gender minority, especially when compared to most countries in the world. However, this acceptance and tolerance can transform into rejection if the gender minority's demands are too unreasonable to grant. That rejection will manifest in forms of abuse and discrimination. Political correctness will have no power in the face of an angry majority with a mob mentality. What is the gender minority currently doing to test the patience of the majority? The gender minority is pressing the objective to have social ideology overshadow millions of years of biology that has shaped human instinct and intuition, and refutes that it should have a role in decisions that will affect society permanently. It is barring the way for qualified professionals to provide needed insight and research to contribute to a more comprehensive view of what is happening with individuals in the gender minority, and if different treatments currently being used are in the best interest of those being treated over time. If you create definitions for words, you can control meaning. If you can control meaning, you can control individuals. If you can control individuals, you can control masses. Having control of the definitions is what will provide the helm for directing the future of society. Transgender has expanded its definition in such a way that all of the other letters in the LGBTQ sequence have no choice but to fall under the transgender umbrella. That is dangerous because it is involuntary misrepresentation. The definition of gender dysphoria itself is younger than my parents and only applied to a tiny fraction of the population when it was originally coined. Instead of 1 out of 30 who fall under the umbrella of transgender in Great Britain today, in 1970, with a population of 7.5 million people, the City of London would have had roughly 75 people who suffer from gender dysphoria. It was far more rare than it is today. By changing the definitions, a trap has been laid where emotionally vulnerable children and youth are caught, where the definitions are presented as explanations and solutions to the questions of identity that young people are asking, that young people of all generations have always been asking. By changing the definitions, the outcome of young people asking those identity questions is also changing, and it is changing for the worse and is destabilizing our society. What is more, the definitions being prescribed by that gender minority are triggering instinctual protective responses that something isn't right. But the definitions are so confusing and camouflaged with sophistication that the average person feels too inferior to voice concern, especially without preparation, and has no hope of being heard out of fear of embarrassment or being accused of hatred toward the gender minority simply for disagreeing with their prescribed definitions. Such definitions are experimental and thus unproven, making them as dangerous as untested vaccines or pharmaceutical drugs. Instead of searching for the answers to identity questions inside of religions, it is logical to shift the search into the area of sexuality to remove the influence of religion from the equation. This is a major culture shift, a shift from a religious-based culture to a sexuality-based culture. To call it anything less is a lie. That these definitions are triggering a fear response is good. We need to listen to that intuition. Nature has worked tirelessly for millennia to grant it to us. To claim that our socially invented ideas are wiser than nature is heresy, as the hubris behind it is both stunning and appalling. with the complexities of hormones operating in our bodies, our most advanced science uses experimentation with different pills and their doses to control the flow of hormones to alter a human's state of mind. This method is primitive and ineffective, and to claim otherwise is hubris. One day, technology will achieve a stage where it can reach into any person and with complete precision control the dials of hormones so that they operate at optimal levels of health. That level of control isn't even on the horizon at the time of this writing. That society believes it can use today's primitive level of science to replicate what has taken nature millions of years to accomplish is also complete hubris and absolute foolishness. It is also reckless as it is dealing with the lives of young people and using today's primitive science to affect young people's sexuality and gender with effects that are also irreversible as a result of our limited and primitive science and technology. It is selfish, and that it must be admitted that this is indeed an experiment, and the test subjects are human beings, and most often young human beings, as they are the most impressionable. These young people are indeed modern human sacrifices to this social experiment to attempt to not just replicate nature, but surpass nature by claiming we know best, even if it isn't true, which also is evidence of incomprehensible hubris, especially in light of the method of using pills to do so. It is like trying to move Mount Everest with a spoon. Nature still knows better than science. Women are biologically different from men. Nature and natural law experimented for millennia to arrive at the solution that works best for our species to perpetuate itself, which requires differences. This is not a bad thing. The gender minority asserts that such a claim is heresy. How dare you claim that is true, is how their unspoken words feel from where I stand. The transgender movement is using its guilt-motivated doctrines to shame society into a new conformity that it has control of. There is a reason why there is a separation between church and state in the United States of America. The union of transgender agendas being codified into law is a breach of the separation between church and state. It isn't a formal religion, which allows it to evade trespassing the separation of church and state, but its overreach is taking control from parents who are the most concerned about the welfare and future of their children and placing the control of the welfare and health of children in the hands of the state. My concern is that children are being told to explore their sexuality and that in a quest to explore one's sexuality, aspects of one's identity will be compromised to a space where solving it becomes a literal matter of life and death, with the authorities directing young people to the wrong solutions in the wrong places. While the state of California may not care if more people become gay, parents care if their children commit suicide. Stated another way, consider the following argument. It is my belief that all people should have the choice to opt out of transhumanist advancements if they want to. Government should not have the power to force that choice on people. With the progress with Neuralink, for example, the time will come that current technologies of augmented reality and access to the library, that is the internet, will combine with Neuralink to make it possible to access the information of the internet by use of a microchip implanted into the brain. Once that technology is available, it should be the individual choice of every human to have the implant or to opt out. If transgender ideology were substituted for the implant in this situation, the law criminalizes anyone who doesn't affirm that it is the correct thing to do, and if socially pressured to consider it as a possibility, parents who don't affirm that as a correct decision to their children would be guilty of child abuse by law, and the government would place them on the conveyor belt to go through the necessary steps to have the surgery anyway. The argument may one day be made that all of society must have this implant, and if they do not, it is just as socially reprehensible as refusing to get a COVID vaccine, because by not doing so, it endangers the whole of society, and so the socially responsible thing to do is to do what is in the best interest of society. That sounds like a logline right out of a dystopian sci-fi novel. So why are we looking past it when it is happening right now? Only it is the sexuality of society that is the operation in question. One of the founding fathers, the first Surgeon General, Sir Benjamin Rush, insisted that the right to choose how you are treated medically be written into the Constitution. Not able to foresee how people could be exploited medically, the founding fathers ignored him and left it out. There aren't many weaknesses in the Constitution, but medical rights are its Achilles heel. By making it law that it is child abuse for parents not to affirm a child acting on education provided by the government will have taken medical rights from parents. That is a dangerous precedent to set for parental rights. Having studied human experimentation in an essay similar to this one, it is clear to me that the transgender opportunity is the gateway to transhumanism and masks human experimentation as a noble thing it is doing under the guise of the civil rights movement. For technology to advance transhumanist ideology, the transgender experiment must be allowed to continue. If it doesn't, science may never reach the point that it can reach into a person and adjust the dials of hormones to optimum levels. Are we willing to sacrifice our young people to be the lab rats and possibly destabilize all of society in the process? It is my opinion that the transhumanist movement should advance its technology using different means. But it has taken a lot of effort to load this particular gun. The momentum is too great, they can't help but pull the trigger. I believe they will keep pulling the trigger as long as they can until there is enough public outcry to stop them. Even with momentum different groups inside of the gender minority have gained, this experiment and discussion is still in its infancy, and it is critical that we force it to be a dialogue and not a lecture. If our intuition is triggered by their definitions, we, the majority, owe it to the future of society, to nature, to God, however you define that, or to all three, to say so, to speak our concern, to add our voice to the discussion, so that we, the complacent majority, does not allow itself to be bulldozed by the unsatisfied vocal minority. In reviewing what I wrote in section 18 about how I doubted I could ever see same-sex marriage the same way that I see traditional marriage, I must say that I have since met and observed same-sex couples who are remarkable parents, who have peaceful and loving atmospheres in their homes, and are exemplars for healthy relationships. From that, I no longer see a difference between them like I did before. I don't think that I changed my mind as a result of having years to dwell on the concept and get used to it. That wasn't it. At work and for recreation, both my wife and I happened upon meeting remarkable people with whom we become quick friends, only to find out later they were same-sex couples. We did not go out of our way to meet them. It happened organically. The development of our friendships has been very natural. After being invited into their homes and spending time with their families, I was struck with the similarities between their parents and my parents, their siblings and my siblings, not differences. It was after spending time with their families and feeling the atmosphere in their homes that the doubt in my mind fizzled out and was replaced with, no, it is possible. What these people have is just as beautiful as what my wife and I have. With life experience, my perspective on that and many other things have changed. I expect my viewpoints on sexuality will continue to evolve as the years pass, and I reserve the right to disagree with my own viewpoints at some point in the future. The stand I am taking. After listening to Michael Sandel's The Moral Side of Murder, where he employs a moral dilemma and the Socratic method to ask a question involving a trolley car accident in which the trolley car has no brakes at a juncture in the tracks, and the driver has the choice to switch from one set of tracks to another. On one set of tracks, 5 will be killed, while on the only alternative, 1 person would be killed. The question is asked, would you do nothing and allow the trolley car to kill the 5, or would you switch the tracks and kill only 1 instead? The answers given begin to unveil moral principles, and Michael Sandel outlines that the syllabus will contrast 2 different kinds of moral reasoning. One locates morality in the consequences of an action, and the other locates morality in certain duties and rights. The first moral reasoning method is rudimentarily summarized under the definition of utilitarianism, which is the doctrine that an action is right insofar as it promotes happiness, and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. Simplified further, it states that actions are right if they are useful or for the benefit of a majority. Most people feel drawn to do what will help the most people. It is so innate in us that it is almost logical. Cue the sparks. Individuals that consider themselves part of the transgender community, whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth, make up a small minority of the population in any nation. Probability says that if a person were to flip a coin repeatedly as the number of flips approaches infinity, the number of times the coin landed on head or tails would get nearer and nearer to 50%. So under that binary approach with a large population size, that law of probability should influence the number of males and females one could expect to find in a population. So what percentage of Great Britain is female? Is it close to 50%? The answer is yes. In Great Britain, 51% of the population is female, and half of 1% of the population identifies as transgender. The transgender community is flipping utilitarianism upside down. It is claiming that the rights of 0.5% of the population are more important than 51% of the population. And that trolley car situation, the transgender community isn't just taking its hands off of the wheel to allow the car to kill the 5 on the tracks instead of the 1. It is taking control of the wheel and making sure it kills 100 people instead of 1. Only in this real-life scenario, we are dealing in the millions. To be clear, transgender ideology is fundamentally at odds with what is in the best interest of women. Women are the creators of the human race. They are the nurturers who nature has selected to hold the majority of the burden of procreation, which means that women are the anchors of human civilization. The fundamental unit of society is the family, and the chief cornerstone of the family, our mothers, are the women. To confuse what women are is a subversive attack on women that can destabilize society. With such consequence, to attack women is to attack the future of humanity. All other minorities that have raised their voices to receive fair treatment from the majority have been met with the realization that equal treatment is just and fair and should be granted to all peoples. Never before has the right to wear one's sexuality been presented as a right, and never before has such a small minority claimed that what is in the best interest of this small minority is also in the best interest of all the majority. The primary right that the transgender community is claiming is theirs is for their sexuality to be made the standard for all of society. That isn't a right, it's the opposite. It is imposing on the rights of everyone else. Until recently, those dealing with gender dysphoria made up between 0.00033 and 0.00001% of the population. And yet the trans community, which does not automatically include gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, is claiming that it is their right to prescribe their method of dealing with their sexuality on all of society. Sexuality is too diverse to provide a beneficial top-down education method for distributing this ideology, and to adopt the sexuality of a group that is a statistical anomaly and make it a standard for all of society is the wrong move. In that way, the rights that the transgender group is clamoring to be given are fundamentally against the rights of women and are not in the best interest of the whole of society. I have a family member that was born a male and now has breasts, a beautiful female name, and she, her pronouns. For the transgender individuals I personally know, their personal lives are a mess, riddled with drama, emotional volatility, and frequent hospital visits. Their sexuality isn't even working for themselves, and they are wanting to push a dysfunctional model on the rest of society. It is absolutely absurd. How did we even get to this point? I have a harsh answer to that question, but I believe that it is true. Humans suffering from narcissistic personality disorder prey on humans that have the opposite trait, which is that of empathy. Remarkably, like how opposites attract, narcissists and empaths are found in relationships in every part of the world. The greatest strength of an empath is also its greatest weakness. Now, all we have to do is swap the transgender movement into the position of the narcissist and the majority into the position of the empath. The majority have sought to meet the needs of the narcissist, and the narcissist has preyed on its weakest points to gain ground, through its tolerance, through its acceptance, through its openness, through its generosity, all which are the majority's best attributes. But in the hands and in the control of a narcissistic group, those best traits are also the greatest weakness. As in narcissist-empath relationships, they all fail eventually. Why? Because just like in the book The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein, the empath will reach a point that it has given all that it can give, and there is nothing else to give. A narcissist can never be satisfied. No matter what is granted, they will always want to take more. The transgender community is the narcissist preying on the majority. They have taken too much, and they are asking for too much. Enough is enough. It is time for this relationship to come to an end. The trans community has all of the rights it needs and more. The time has come to scale back to a place of sensibility for all. How have I come to this conclusion? Humans born with two X chromosomes who choose to alter their female genitalia and transition to male genitalia pose no threat to human adult males. The inverse is not true. Humans born with an X and Y chromosome who choose to alter their male genitalia and transition to female genitalia pose threats to women in too many diverse ways to be enumerated. This reality must be spoken. It must be discussed. By not discussing it, we are putting the welfare of the few above the welfare of the majority. We are putting the welfare of the few so high in priority that it will compromise the structure of society unless we choose to take a stand and stop it. So let me work through that backwards. I believe that a future with humans in it is good. For that reason, the future of society is important to me. Society cannot continue without women, and for that reason, women need to be protected. If they are so feminist that they refuse to allow men to protect them, that is completely fine. They can defend themselves, but they need to defend themselves. And if they don't, or if they are losing the fight, then men need to stand up for them as well and declare that what is being done to them is unacceptable. To quote my wife, on a level, it feels like a biological need to fight for our rights again, like we have forgotten the sacrifices of the suffragettes and the feminist movement, that men are infiltrating our rights as women on the deepest level by taking away who we are and claiming it for themselves. And we are allowing this? Where are our rights? In the Republic, Plato spends a number of pages making a case for why and how artists are liars, because they make counterfeits of nature, and thus counterfeits of reality. If Plato's logic is sound, then transgenders are liars, as they claim to be something they are not and are counterfeits of reality. A woman is a creature of resilience and fierceness that has evolved as a being of reproduction, which has risen time and again as leaders in social hierarchy to command and direct the development of entire cultures. A woman is a being of creation, and as such has the capacity to command majesty and deserves reverence. Whether by divinity or evolution makes no difference. Women are the holders of the future of the human race, as they are assigned as the stewards of human life. This is a natural process that needs no improvement or tampering by man-made machines. Nature has refined the process, and women are beings of power, capable of delivering new life into the world. Men are none of those things, and a man impersonating a woman, even with a strong desire to be so, does not make him so. Society does not deny him this. Nature and millions of years of evolution deny him this. Biology, greater forces with greater momentum than societal culture are at work and deny him this reality. He may not relate to men, but no level of science can make him a woman. It can emulate or impersonate the features of a woman, but it is an offense of the deepest kind to claim a desire and have it qualify and match millennia of nature's work. Saying it is so will never make it so. I am a defender of feminism. Humanity demands it remain pure if the species is to thrive. I believe in biology. Men who claim to be women are not women. They may no longer be men, but they are not women, and it is acceptable to call them something else, but it is an insult to all women and what they do and have done to award the same title of woman. They are not the same, and simply wishing it does not make it so. The weight of trying to make sense of all this has been immense for me. My mind is tired. The complexity and interconnected nature of difficult concepts and questions have a dampening spirit upon me, and I am eager to finish this chapter, set down this essay, and leave this behind me. Ignore all these things the best I can, so that I can actually enjoy the beauty that life has to offer. I miss sitting in nature. I need it. I am drying out inside, and I desperately need to be revitalized. I need healing. I need rest. Most of all, my mind needs rest. It has been far too troubled for far too long. I seek a sanctuary. I am ready for something restorative. I need it. I am concerned for our young people also. While searching in the wrong places for answers to personal identity and in exploring sexuality, destabilizes their physical and mental health, that self-preservation will be such a priority, there will be no time to worry about morality. Hopefully, in listening to this, your mind has not had to do as much heavy lifting as mine has, and hopefully you don't have to feel as I feel. I sympathize with what Stephen must have been thinking after saying what he felt compelled to say. Here come the stones, and that's okay. I have been an aspiring novelist for years. After this, I doubt any publisher or agent will consider taking me on, but that's a small price to pay for conscience. For the rest of you, keep your chin up and have a blessed day. Final words. Listening to this essay is merely a starting point, and the conversation you have after is equally as important, as the point of the essay is to create discussions. In the entire writing of this essay, I deliberately didn't share these ideas with anyone, as I didn't want anyone else to influence my thought process. I wanted to make it completely my own. These ideas are my own and do not reflect the ideas of my wife, friends, family, or religion. These are the ideas of one young man trying to figure this out. I wish to dedicate this essay to young people of faith who are navigating their sexuality and find themselves among the gender minority. Speaking to that audience, my hope is that if your struggle with your sexuality leads you to a dark place, that the words and ideas here will help you choose life. God loves you. You are valuable, and the world needs your life and vibrance. God chose you to be His spirit children and wants you to live into all of your potential and natural talents and gifts. He has placed gems of truth in all kinds of places in every part of the earth to help you discover how to be your best self. Choose to live so you can find them. I firmly believe the world is better with you in it. I am Saul Rip, and I am a Mormon. Thank you for listening to these ideas. The end.